Dianetics 55, The Complete Manual of Human Communication by L. Ron Hubbard. Preface. Secret. Secrets, secrets, secrets. Ah, the endless quest, the far, far search, the codes, the vias, the symbols, the complications, the compilations, the mathematicity and abstractacity of secrets, secrets, secrets. And truth. Truth. From Keats to Johnny Jones, we all have traffic with the truth, truth, truth. The professors have a truth. The religionists have a truth. The stars and almost anything but government have a truth, truth, truth. Knowledge. Endeared as a precious torch, abhorred as a neurotic's nightmare, it is all knowledge, knowledge, knowledge. You get diplomas for it, and buy books full of it. You perish for the lack of it or triumph in the absence of it. But whatever it might be, knowledge is precious, dangerous, valueless, and horrible, and craved. And what is knowledge? And what is the secret? And what is truth? Pontius Pilate asked the question when he washed his hands. Alexander executed messengers when the truth was unpalatable. The Chaldean priest corralled a bit of truth and ruled Chaldea into yesterday and Babylon into dust motes. And rulers and men, scholars and generals have condemned with it, dedicated their lives to it, fought for it and denied it, and have never defined it. What is truth? What is knowledge? What is the secret? Are they inventions from a shaman's dream? Are they connected with science? Do they belong to philosophy? What are they? Whence do they come? Do they exist? Are they owned? Have they ever been written or spoken or guessed? And would one go mad if he knew them? Dianetics moved into the world on May 9, 1950, with the publication of a book, Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health. It moved with violence, although its message was peace. 500,000 Americans read it. Many of these acted upon it and are still acting upon it. And every year it sells still more copies than the average bestseller. Dianetics was an adventure into the dark realms of the secret to accumulate knowledge and to establish the truth. Until Dianetics, these commodities have been owned by philosophy of either the esoteric or the monotony schools, or had been used by the charlatan, with or without surplus, to lure and ensnare. Dianetics moved into a dark age of reason, where only a physical universe fact was given credence. When Dianetics was born, every freethinker man had known had long since been burned or poisoned or dustbinned into the curriculums of universities. It was an age where renown awaited only the manufacturer, not the inventor, of the new can opener, where sanity was adjusted with electrodes and philosophy was made with univacs. Knowledge and the secret being the total assets of vested interest, Dianetics was hit with violence from many quarters. Medicine, entirely cognizant that it could not cure nor even alleviate the majority of man's ills, yet like a prima donna who can but croak, yet resists the incoming next act, bluntly and viciously condemned in leading weekly magazines any further glance toward knowledge and truth. The government, fighting a war at the time, entirely cognizant that its pilot supply was old and slow, yet could not communicate on any subject which might remedy the matter. The Better Business Bureaus of the U.S., an organization solidly behind anything good and solid, upheld the objection of capital to this new idea. The Communist Party, being solidly against any alteration of the mind, since that would undoubtedly alter devotion, went to considerable lengths to assist the stand of capital. To anyone who wanted a monopoly on knowledge and truth, Dianetics was an enemy. To them it was a degraded, wicked, fraudulent hoax, or so they said. However, there happens to be a principle that anything which is thoroughly understood ceases. Their opinion of Dianetics could not have been correct because Dianetics is still here. During the ensuing 4 years of commotion, much happened. The only orderly and progressive thing which happened was that Dianetics went on encroaching into the territory of the secret along the roadway of knowledge to discover nearer truth. The primary assault of Dianetics was upon reverence and forms. The first book was written as a javelin directed into the doubtlessly sacrosanct vitals of philosophical departments and literature. It was carefully careless with its commas, in the belief that commas, contrary to the prevailing mode, have little power to disturb an ultimate truth. The first book was written to be read and understood, and it was written to upset and override and warn off those who would give it the fate of being reverable. And the first book was written to be used by anyone who could understand it and the way it was written. This, of course, could not include the extant mental charlatan, spelled psychiatrist, nor the professional dabbler in abilities, the psychologist. As one had learned these two could not be trained, and if they could have been, wouldn't have been interested in the proposed goals, it was necessary that a new breed of feline come into being, the auditor, and the auditor did. Now, this adventure along the road of knowledge toward truth was very shiny new in 1950. It is not quite so new, but much shinier in 1954. Certain promises were made in 1950, and these promises have now been kept. Man can be cleared. He can be cleared, brought to the condition described in Chapter 2 of the first book, by a well-studied and competent auditor in a relatively short length of time. This book contains the processes by which clearing can be accomplished. This does not mean that auditors do not have to be trained, for we have found that they do. It does mean that an auditor who has been trained and processed can now take these newer processes and run them as directed and can achieve the result of clear. Thus, in Dianetics 55, we have actually the second book of Dianetics. Everyone has assigned the title First Book to Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. But nobody has ever referred to Science of Survival, published in 1951, as the second book. They haven't because it obviously wasn't. Science of Survival was a first book in its own right. It was the first book of and under Plan C, in the last chapter of the real first book. Science of Survival adventured into causation, not into the resolution of problems outlined in the first book. Thus, there has never been a second book of Dianetics. Such a book would have to take the exact problems of the first book and, in the terms and references of the first book, resolve those problems. Well, as one looks over fiction novels and technical volumes in general, he finds that a 4-year, almost 5, lag between an author's first and second volume would discover his public to have waned. But when we take up a subject of the status of Dianetics, and when we realize that it is condensing into a few years some thousands of years of doing, we see that a lag of 4 or 5 years between volumes isn't so very bad. What happened in those 4 or 5 years? Many things. Somehow, for one thing, research and development was financed, and the basic organization, after many limpings, survived. A lot of petty things happened, which in another decade will be bone dust. For none of these things, none of the tales of terror, the attacks, the financing, the business advances, were permitted to interrupt the only thing that can mean any difference, the product of years of steady gain on the road of knowledge toward the goal of ultimate truth. Knowledge, truth, secrets, they are the guts and anatomy of life. They must not then be owned. They must not then be hidden or bent. They must be permitted to stand out in the bold sunlight for all to see, for only when they are to be seen are they safe things to have, to hold, to know. This is the second book of Dianetics. It could mean a new earth. It could mean a new freedom. But whatever it means, it cannot mean nothing in the sense man uses that word. For you cannot unveil the secret and have it ever be quite so secret ever again. L. Ron Hubbard, Phoenix, 1954. Chapter 1. Dianetics. Why should anyone want to know anything about the human mind? And for that matter, why should anyone believe that knowledge of the human mind is either unobtainable or undesirable? Why should men, ostensibly seeking answers to the mind, stray so far from it as to examine rats and entirely avoid looking at human beings? And why should anyone, pretending to treat the mind, stray so far afield as electric shock? The answers are relatively simple. Anyone who knows the structure, function, and dynamics of the human mind is very difficult to control. The only way a mind can be controlled is by enforcing upon it ignorance of itself. As far as study and treatment is concerned, a mind which has been made ignorant of itself would have to have restored to it awareness of its fundamentals before it could be considered to be recovered. When one restores full awareness to a mind, one is no longer able to victimize it, and a profession or a society would have to move out of slave orientation into action by freedom and consent were it to be effective. Just as you do not want people to control you, so you should want knowledge of yourself and others. Just as you fight away from knowingness concerning self, so you will be controlled. A simple and conclusive science of mind is a vital necessity in any society which desires to become free and remain free. The only elements in a society which would combat or contest or dispute an effort to attain such a science would be those interests which desired, by ignorance, to maintain their control of a slavery. Each and every impulse of freedom is an impulse toward sanity, toward health, toward happiness. Every impulse toward slavery is an impulse in the direction of misery, disease, and death. One can say alike of the arthritic and the neurotic that the basic cause of disturbance, physical or mental, germinated in efforts to reduce the freedom of the individual, the group, or mankind. Dianetics is an effort toward the attainment by man of a level of freedom where decency and happiness can prevail, and where knowledge of the mind itself would prevent the unscrupulous use of the mechanisms of slavery. Dianetics can be contested, it can be vilified, its founder and practitioners can be publicly pilloried, but Dianetics cannot be ignored. It could neither be drowned in praise nor burned in some purge to its total eradication. For it is a wonderfully observable fact that the one impulse in man which cannot be erased is his impulse toward freedom, his impulse toward sanity, toward higher levels of attainment in all of his endeavors. This is man's one saving grace. And because Dianetics is such an impulse, and because its basic purposes from the moment of its conception have been dedicated unswervably to the attainment of even greater freedom, it cannot perish, a fact which will become doubtlessly more annoying to the slave masters as the years roll on. There is much argument upon which we could adventure concerning whether Dianetics is an art or a science, whether it is a humanity or a hoax. But all this would avail us very little, for we would only be quibbling with words. Dianetics is what it is, and the totality of it can best be summed by the description, an understanding of man. We do not care whether or not it is a science. We do not care whether or not it is more properly catalogued under adventure or mystery. We do care whether or not it is promulgated and known, for everywhere it walks, slavery ceases. That mind which understands itself is the mind of a free man. It is no longer prone to obsessive behavior, unthinking compliances, covert innuendos. It is at home in an environment, not a stranger. It is the solver of problems and the maker of games. A mind that is enslaved is weak. A mind that is free is powerful. And all the power there is defined by and contained in freedom. Why should you know something about your mind? A question of a similar magnitude would be, why should you live? A science fiction writer once conceived a world composed entirely of machines, composed to a point where the machines were repaired by other machines, which in turn were repaired by yet other machines, and so the circle went round and the machines survived. He wrote this story from the fondest belief of nuclear physicists that there is only a machine, that man derived from some spontaneous combustion of mud, that the soul does not exist, that freedom is impossible, that all behavior is stimulus-response, that causative thought cannot exist. What a world this would be! And yet this world, this pattern, is the goal of the slave-makers. If every man could be depressed from his freedom to a point where he believed himself but a cog in an enormous machine, then all things would be enslaved. But who would there be to enjoy them? Who would there be to profit? Not the slave-maker, for he is the first to succumb. He succumbs to his own mechanisms. He receives the full jolt of his own endeavors to entrap. What would be the purpose of this world of machines? There can be no purpose worth contemplating which does not include happiness and experience. When a man is no longer able to envision happiness as a part of his future, that man is dead. he has become nothing but an animated robot, without understanding, without humanity, perfectly willing then to compose missiles of such detonative quality that an entire civilization can perish, and that the happiness of all could be destroyed in the experience of radiation, an experience which might be considered digestible by an atomic pile, but not by a human being. Thus, as we depart from the concepts of freedom, we depart into a darkness where the will, the fear, and the brutality of one or a few, no matter how well educated, may yet obliterate everything for which we have worked, everything for which we have hoped. This is what happens when the machine runs wild, and when man, become a machine, runs wild. Man can only become a machine when he is no longer capable of understanding his own beingness and has lost his contact with it. Thus, it is of enormous importance that we understand something about the mind, that we understand we are minds, that we are not machines. And it is of enormous importance that man attain at once to some higher level of freedom, where the machine reaction of destruction may be controlled, and where man himself can enjoy some of the happiness to which he is entitled. Dianetics, the modern science of mental health, was written into a world where atomic fission was yet in its early stages. Dianetics 55 is being written in a world where bombs exist of such fury that a continent could be laid waste. The recent declaration of the Secretary of War of the United States of America that such weapons exist and are capable of being used, and his assumption that men exist with such insufficiency of humanity that they would use such weapons, tells us that it is time someone, somewhere, took a hand in this game. The intimacy of his promises cannot be escaped. You would think anyone a madman who essayed to destroy every book in every library in the United States and Russia. You would think a man quite insane if he insisted upon the destruction of all of your personal possessions. You would know he was mad when he insisted that the only course for the future was the destruction of your body and any future race to remember it. Only a raving, drooling madman could contemplate the ending of all goals everywhere on earth. And only an apathetic fool would stand by motionless before the inevitable destruction of his most intimate dreams, his fondest hopes, his possessions, even on down to the identification cards and money in his wallet. Such destruction permits no inheritance. It means an end of everything for which we have all hoped, for which we and our ancestors have strived. And it is my belief that an individual who can contemplate this with equanimity and without an impulse to act is so lost to the race and lost to himself, to his family and to his friends, that he must personally believe there is no hope for anything, anywhere, at any time. Such depravity is difficult to envision. We know definitely that the wrong thing to do is nothing. Whenever any situation may develop, we always have that answer. It is wrong to do nothing. The only time anyone has ever gotten into serious trouble was when he decided he could do nothing about something. This was the entering threshold toward death, when one knew at last that he was powerless in the face of all fates or of any one particular fate. He was to that degree a slave of those fates. Thus, the wrong thing to do in this world at this time is nothing. No matter what fantastic or incredible plan we adventure upon, no matter how we put it forward, it would still be better than the abandonment of all plans and all action. It may be that we have better plans than fantastic plans. It may be that we, possessed of a knowledge of the mind and of man, can yet restrain this dreadful crime of oblivion from occurring. Dianetics, then, is a weapon. It is a timely weapon. It is the only weapon of defense in existence which can confront with equanimity nuclear fission. Dianetics can fail only if it is not used, only if those who know about it do not use it to its fullest extent. Were you to take the technologies of Dianetics this day, and seeking out anyone even remotely connected with the responsibility for waging atomic war, apply these techniques to them, you would soon have the man into a sufficiently high strata of humanity that he would recognize some of his responsibility to the human race. Your task would be made hard, for all those who are connected with the waging of war with atomic fission are restrained by law from receiving any psychotherapy. If this seems incredible to you, you should realize that anyone in a top secret or confidential classification in a government is not supposed to impart any information of his calling. And it is the fear of governments that some of this information might be imparted to someone practicing in the field of mental healing. Thus, if anyone connected with nuclear fission is discovered to be undergoing processing of any kind, he would be immediately relieved of his post and his top secret classification would be cancelled. But this is not a hopeless picture. Supposing one processed them all and had all their top secret classifications cancelled, who would be left? Or supposing one pointed out this idiocy with sufficient conviction to those in charge of, but who are not responsible for, the destinies of man, and made it mandatory that the sanity of anyone connected with the creation or use of atomic fission be required to have a sanity passport. Only the insane will destroy. Remember that. Only the insane would bring about the end of Earth. One of these men, fumbling forward, uncomprehending, a mere machine, given processing, begins to realize that he is not without responsibility for the safety of humanity. Only when he is a slave could he be forced to use such weapons against mankind. There is no argument on earth of sufficient emergency or violence to require war, much less war by atomic fission, with the consequence of a destruction of at least one continent and within a few years the destruction of the planet Earth. Who would believe that anyone could wipe a continent clean of life without at once so polluting the atmosphere of Earth as to endanger or eradicate all further life forms on this planet? What argument could there be amongst men which could occasion such a fate for Earth? There is no such argument amongst men. Such an argument could arise amongst machines, which consciencelessly, by pushed buttons, reach conclusions for which they have no responsibility. There are many ways in which a higher state of security could be attained for Earth. None of these ways include violence or revolution. All of them include a greater freedom for mankind. Dianetics is the key technology necessary for the control of atomic fission. Remember that. And remember also that Dianetics is a precision science, that it works only when it is used as a precision science. For if you are to accomplish anything with it, whether the rescue of a relative from the pain of continued psychosomatic illness, of a group, a nation, or a world, it works exactly along the lines it is designed. It does not work with innovations. It is a precision science. It has a precision mission. It contains more answers than man has ever had before. And it contains enough answers to make man free, if it is used. Chapter 2. The Fundamentals of Life. Much more broadly covered in Scientology, the fundamentals of life yet differ in no way for man. The basic subdivision in life is between ability and mechanics. This can also be described, but less accurately, as a subdivision of quality and quantity. Where mechanics have ability, the ability is only apparent and has been endowed into the mechanics by life. It is all right to suppose that an electronic brain is capable of thought, as long as one realizes that life itself must necessarily be present in order to give cause and quality or direction to such a brain. An electronic brain will sit all day and do nothing unless life starts the machine running. It will give millions of answers, but none of these, no matter how sharp, have any meaning until they are viewed by life. The machine is never anything more than a servo mechanism to life. Indeed, a machine cannot even exist in the absence of life. By mechanics we mean any and all of the objects, motions, or spaces which exist. Foremost of these, and foremost in any mechanical scheme, is space. Next is energy. Next is condensed or solidified energy called matter. And finally, always present in any mechanical arrangement or mechanic, that relative change of position of particles or objects known as time. Thus we have space, energy, matter, and time. Whether we are considering a body running on any energy, an automobile, or a mountain, we are still dealing with what we call here mechanics. Mechanics are always quantitative. There is always just so much distance, or so much mass, or so many hours. The quality of space, energy, matter, and time has value only when viewed, used, or monitored by life, and indeed cannot exist in the absence of life. Correct or not, this is workable and is our primary assumption. We have a word for mechanics, compounded from matter, energy, space, and time, which is MEST. By MEST we mean any or all arrangements of energy of whatever kind, whether in fluid or object form, in space or spaces. We do not conceive life to have an energy, and therefore any energy, even if directly produced by life, can be found to be embraced under the quantitative term mest. Life itself has quality and ability. The products of quality and ability are mechanics. Ability is demonstrated by the handling of matter, energy, space, and time. Quality means simply valued or having a value. No values, that is to say opinions, exist in the absence of life. In the matter of such a thing as an automatic switch, we might consider that the switch is capable of making a decision, whether to be off or on. However, we must remember that the original decision that a switch was to be made, and that off and on could be accomplished, and indeed the design of the switch itself depended entirely upon life quality. In the field of mechanics, we do not discover creativeness. We discover varying condition, varying arrangement, deterioration and destruction of one or another form. But we do not discover any alteration in quantity. Indeed, the entire science of physics is predicated upon the assumption of conservation of energy, which is to say that energy itself cannot be created and destroyed, but can only alter its forms. To this we might add conservation of space, conservation of matter, and conservation of time. None of these things are capable in themselves of altering. They are not capable of more than change of position or alteration of form. The physicist is very fond of demonstrating that the breaking of a vase does no more than alter the relative position of the particles and the form, and that the burning of a piece of coal does not change the basic particles of matter, since if you were to collect all the smoke, all the ash and the particles which radiated from the burning, and weighed them, you would have the same weight as before the coal was burned. In other words, the quantity of matter does not change, and as above, it does not create to itself or add to itself in any way. Life, it has been adequately established, can, however, create. It can create particles, and it can add to mass. The demonstration of this on a man is an easily accomplished thing and is quite conclusive. A process known as the remedy of havingness is capable of altering the weight of a man, upwards of 20 to 35 pounds, even though there is no change whatsoever in the diet or living habits of that person. In other words, the life which is in the body of the man, and which is actually the man, can by a certain process increase the amount of mass of this man. Another process known as perfect duplication can reverse this and again, without change of diet or the living habits of a man, decrease the amount of mass of a man without the complications of heat or waste products being present. Thus, forthrightly and directly, in the same frame of reference as that used by the physicist, it is easily demonstrated that life does create mass and can cause mass to disappear. As long ago as 50 years, as represented by an article in the Encyclopedia Britannica, it was fairly well understood that the study of physics should have begun with an examination of the mind. This article, under the heading of Time and Space, states that, as space and time are mental phenomena, their proper delineation and study begins in the field of the mind. 19th century mental sciences were insufficiently schooled in science to comprehend this, and the physicist, unaware in general of such a fact, did not consider that his proper province was the mind. Thus a misunderstanding existed in the humanities and in the sciences, where one was depending upon the other, and the result came about that neither knew his proper field of endeavor. By undertaking a study of the mind from the orientation of physics and with the application of all the principles known in chemistry, physics, and mathematics, items in which the 19th century psychologist was entirely unfamiliar, and which the 20th century psychologist utterly disdains, it was only then possible to produce some comprehension of this thing we call life in this place we call the physical universe. Thus that thing which considers, that thing which has opinions, that thing which creates, that thing which monitors, that thing which has goals and desires and which can experience, is life. What we call space, time, energy, matter, forms of any kind, are the byproducts of and are monitored by life. Energy, whether in the form of a mental image, a body, a tree, or a rock, are alike the byproducts of life. There is no faintest difference, save only density and wavelength, between the space you behold around you with your physical eyes and the spaces and forms you see when you close them and behold a mental image. These things alike are energies and obey the various laws of energy. Here, then, we have a unit or a quality capable of bringing into being quantities such as spaces, energy, masses, and time, capable of changing and controlling these masses and energies, capable of adding to them or subtracting from them. There was a considerable dissertation in Dianetics, the modern science of mental health, concerning the awareness of awareness unit. When this subject was first under investigation, it was established that all was not a machine. Somewhere, in tracing back the various lines, it was necessary to strike a cause point, either simply to assume that there was a cause point or to actually discover one. Two names were used in connection with this causative agent. One of them was analytical mind, and the other, much more properly, the awareness of awareness unit. The awareness of awareness unit was, as its name implies, aware of being aware, or aware of being alive. When one was looking at or discussing the analytical mind, one was aware of something else, that the awareness of awareness unit became connected in some fashion with computers or analyzers in order to handle and control the remainder of the physical beingness. The term analytical mind then meant the awareness of awareness unit plus some evaluative circuit or circuits or machinery to make the handling of the body possible. The other item discussed broadly in Dianetics, the modern science of mental health, was the reactive mind. This mind was a stimulus-response mind which depended upon exterior direction for its action and reaction. The reactive mind was conceived to be a collection of records in picture form, so arranged as to make a complete pattern of experience, capable by its pattern alone of evaluating the conduct and behavior of the individual. The pictures contained in the reactive mind are now called facsimiles, for they are no more and no less than pictures, like photographs, taken of the universe around the individual and retained by him. A specialized kind of facsimile was the engram. This differed from other mental pictures because it contained, as part of its content, unconsciousness and physical pain. The definition of an engram is a picture of a moment of pain and unconsciousness. The reactive mind was conceived to have more of these engrams than the analyzer, but the analyzer was seen to have some of these too, except they were a lighter form and were a lock on the engram in the reactive memory bank. Indeed, when one considered the reactive mind, he was actually considering what is, in the electronic brain, a memory bank. Instead of cards or a card file system, the reactive mind contained pictures. These pictures were filed and were drawn out of the files by the environment, which contained restimulators. The presence of these pictures could alter form and could alter behavior. The eradication of one of these engrams by the early erasure techniques of Dianetics was found to alter the stimulus-response behavior of the individual. Here we were confronting three kinds of minds. One was the causative agent, the awareness of awareness unit, which did not appear to have any byproducts, but which was impinged upon another mind, called the analytical mind, which, on a machine basis, analyzed situations rationally and was sane and rational. And a third kind of mind, the reactive mind, even further remote from the awareness of awareness unit, which acted without the consent of the causative agent and did not in any way consult it. Now, on a very careful review of this, we see that the analytical mind and the reactive mind alike are byproduct mechanical minds. Alike, they depend upon energy, spaces, storage, and other quantitative things. The awareness of awareness unit, however, is itself decision, is itself knowingness. It delivers into the analytical mind and its systems various knowingnesses to be handled on a mechanical basis, and unwittingly delivers into the hands of the reactive mind, which is totally a mechanical thing, the right to alter and correct the analytical mind. Apparently, then, we have here a causative agent and two machines. We might as well, then, take the obvious conclusion that there is the awareness of awareness unit and that this in some fashion handles machinery, and that the analytical mind, the reactive mind, and even the body and the environment are mechanical. One item here is qualitative and decisional, the awareness of awareness unit. All other items are subordinate to it and depend for their conclusions either upon it or upon the environment. Here again we have quality versus quantity. A further demonstration of this awareness of awareness unit in action is quite convincing. A machine, a meter, which is built in every tradition of physics and electronics, and which is composed of nothing more or less than the usual meters and gauges and electrodes, can detect the production of energy by the analytical mind. This machine, one of which is at the headquarters of Harvard Professional College, demonstrates conclusively that the awareness of awareness unit can predict and cause an energy reaction to occur at will. It goes further and demonstrates that the awareness of awareness unit can bring about, without further contact, an energy flow in a body at a distance. This is a very startling demonstration and is one of the more significant electrical discoveries of recent times. The conditions of the experiment are sufficiently rigorous to dispel any doubt in the mind of a physicist concerning the authenticity of the current. If there were no energy being created by the awareness of awareness unit, then one would be at a loss to account for mental energy pictures. For these things, being made at a tremendously rapid rate, have considerable mass in them, mass which is measurable on a thing as common and as everyday as the bathroom scales. As soon as it was discovered how facsimiles, these mental energy pictures, came into being, it was also discovered that they were actual energy and not an idea of energy as they have been supposed to be in the past. The facsimile and the engram come into action by resistance. The awareness of awareness unit resists a scene in the physical universe, either resisting its approach or departure, and thus by this resistance makes a print. This print is made in a moving fashion, like a motion picture, and is complete in every detail. Later on, the individual can call back this print and take a look at it, and will find it to have in it the exact forces which were in the original version in the physical universe. The awareness of awareness unit does this so easily that it has been completely unaware of what it was doing. Now, when the awareness of awareness unit makes a print, trying to restrain something from going away or trying to restrain it from approaching, and considers that the survival of its body is being violated or threatened, it files this print in such a way that it will not have to look at it again. But this does not mean that an approximation of the print by the physical environment cannot reactivate the print independently. In other words, when the awareness of awareness unit puts away and does not want to look again at such a facsimile, the facsimile itself begins to have a power over the awareness of awareness unit. The collected files of these non-survival experiences come together and are the reactive mind. The awareness of awareness unit could be conscious of these, but chooses not to be. Thus, the environment can restimulate this reactive mind and can cause changes of behavior and bodily form, such as overweight, psychosomatic ills, or even fixed expressions or gestures. The essence of time is change. Where there is no change, there is no time. Thus, something which is unchanging is enduring. If a thing has no change in it, it will then float in all time, since it does not assign itself to any changingness, being a thing of no change. Thus we discover that silences and no motions float in time. And we discover that every place on the time track where the awareness of awareness unit has taken a picture of silence, has resented or restrained silence, it then has an energy mass which will float or stay with it, whatever time it assigns to itself. And we get the composition of the physical universe. The physical universe is composed of floating, or forever, energy. If this did not work out in processing, and if it were not a usable principle, it would not be included in this text. In view of the fact that these facsimiles, particularly those of silence, can stay with the individual, then we get the entire mechanism we call restimulation, where the environment reactivates a facsimile which then acts back against the body or awareness of awareness unit of the person. This is a very simple system of stimulus response. We discover then that engrams or facsimiles in general have a tendency to hang up on all of their silent or motionless spots. Thus, a facsimile may contain considerable action and yet be stuck at one point of no motion. Here we have a no motion on either side of which there is motion. The no motion point hangs up and is not contacted by the awareness of awareness unit, since the awareness of awareness unit is looking in general for motion. Thus, we get a phenomenon known as stuck on the time track, where an individual can believe himself to be at some distant point in the past. The facsimile or engram in which he is caught has almost as much reality to him as a condition of existence as his present time environment. When he becomes entirely psychotic, the facsimile or engram has far more reality to him than his present time environment. Thus, we have aberration, psychosomatic illness. In early Dianetics, the way this condition was alleviated was by addressing the pictures themselves and persuading the awareness of awareness unit to erase them by recounting them and re-experiencing them. Because this took a long time and because auditors had a tendency to abandon half-erased incidents, the technologies, while workable, were not conclusive. Thus, more research and investigation had to be entered upon in order to establish the best way to handle this situation. Chapter 3. The Awareness of Awareness Unit. In examining the individuality and identity of the individual, one discovers that the individual is himself and not his byproducts. The individual is not his analytical mind. He is not his reactive mind. He is not his body any more than he is his house or his car. He might consider himself to be associated with his analytical mind, his reactive mind, his house, his body, his car, but he is not these things. He is himself. The individual, the personality, is the awareness of awareness unit, and the awareness of awareness unit is the person. As this awareness of awareness unit confuses itself further and further with the pictures it has made of its surroundings, it conceives itself more and more to be an object until at last, when it has gone entirely down tone scale, it has arrived at the point where its fondest belief is that it is an object. Just as you would not say that John Jones was his car, so must you also say, when you perceive this clearly, that John Jones is not his analytical mind or his reactive mind, his body or his clothes. John Jones is an awareness of awareness unit, and all there is of him that is capable of knowing and being aware is John Jones, an awareness of awareness unit. When we have arrived at a state where John Jones himself knows that he is an awareness of awareness unit, and is not his analytical mind, his reactive mind, his body, his clothes, his house, his car, his wife, or his grandparents, we have what is called in Dianetics a clear. A clear is simply an awareness of awareness unit which knows it is an awareness of awareness unit, can create energy at will, and can handle and control, erase or recreate an analytical mind or a reactive mind. The difference of approach is this. Instead of erasing all the things with which the awareness of awareness unit is in conflict, we make the awareness of awareness unit capable of besting and controlling all those things with which he thought he had to be in conflict. In other words, we raise the determinism of an individual up to a point where he is capable of controlling his mental pictures and the various byproducts of life. When he is capable, so far as his ability is concerned, of controlling and determining the action of these things, he is no longer aberrated. He can recall anything he wants to recall without the aid and assistance of energy masses. He can be what he wants to be. He has had restored to himself a considerable freedom. About the only difficulty we have in accomplishing this state of clear, with all the power and ability appended thereto, is the fact that individuals come to believe that they have to have certain things in order to go on surviving. Actually, an awareness of awareness unit cannot do anything else but survive. He is unkillable, yet his byproducts are destroyable. And confusing himself with his byproducts, he begins to believe that he has to have or do certain things in order to survive. His anxiety becomes so great on this that he will even believe that he has to have problems in order to survive. An awareness of awareness unit is very unhappy unless it has some mass or space of some kind and has various problems to solve. For a very long time in Dianetics, we looked far for the one-shot clear. Such a thing has come into existence and is workable on over 50% of the current populace of mankind. The one-shot clear depends, of course, on getting the awareness of awareness unit at a distance from and in control of its various byproducts so that it no longer confuses itself with its byproducts. The astonishing speed with which 50% of the human race can be cleared is believable only when you put it into action. The magic words are, "Be 3 feet back of your head." This is the one-shot clear. If the existence of a one-shot clear, or the process, is indigestible to people, It is because they have so long contemplated objects and have their attention so thoroughly fixed upon objects that they can no longer view space. And the idea of viewing space, the idea of being without objects, is so antipathetic to them that they feel they must condemn any effort which might take from them the proximity of some of their fondest possessions. It is so strongly antipathetic to man to look at space that one of the basic processes of Dianetics, causing him to look at spots in space, will cause a rather low-toned individual to become quite violently ill at his stomach. The nausea resulting simply from contemplating empty space is discoverable only in those who have a great deal of trouble with possessions and who are unable to have things. From having to have things, they have gotten to a point of where they do not believe they can have anything anymore. Thus, being asked to contemplate an emptiness of any kind is enough to cause a violent physical reaction. Hence, this whole subject of clear and exteriorization, as it is technically termed, is very antipathetic to the remaining 50% of the human race who cannot be hit instantly with this one-shot button. 50% of the people you walk up to, if you do not pre-select your pre-clears, a person on the road to being clear, will immediately exteriorize, be a distance from their body, and behold themselves as capable of handling a great many things they before considered impossible to control the moment you say, "Be 3 feet back of your head." The remaining 50% will look at you with varying puzzlement. These know they are a body. These know they are an object. And these know, most of them, that they would get sick at their stomachs if they contemplated being all by themselves in space. They would believe it would be impossible to control a body while being 3 feet behind it. Thus, one gets into an immediate argument with such people, and they wish to go into the various deeper significances. If these people were lost to us with current Dianetic processes, we would still have gained many percentiles over any past effort to do something for the race or about the mind. In the past, even when we look as short a time ago as 1949, we discover that man in general did not possess the ability to get a recovery percentage in patients higher than 22%. Oddly enough, whether it was a witch doctor at work, a psychoanalyst, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a medical doctor, or any other practitioner, simple assurance and a pat on the back yet brought about 22% cure. This fact, not looked at very carefully by practitioners, caused people to believe that the only thing that was wrong with the mind was that people thought something was wrong with the mind, and all anybody needed was a cheery word, and it would all be all right. 22% of any population will recover if anything is done for them. The remaining 78% are not quite so lucky. When we can raise the percentage even to 30%, we are doing more than has ever been done before. When any practice gets less than 22% recovery, then that practice is actually definitely harming people. For if all the practitioner did was be at home in his office and give cheery reassurance to his patients, he would get this 22%. He would have to be very active and depressive in order to decrease this amount of cures. Now, when we suddenly vault to the figure of 50%, we know we are closing with the answer. Thus, we could relax at this very point, confident that we have done more in the field of healing than has ever before been done. However, it is not good enough within our framework. In the first place, if we wish to treat people involved with the government, people involved with ruling, people involved with the material sciences, such as physicists and chemists, we are dealing with almost entirely the remaining resistive 50%. This does not mean that a person simply by exteriorizing is weaker. It means that a person with continuous contact with the physical universe and continuous harassment and concern over the state of objects or energy is apt to get what we call interiorized. A recent series of cases undertaken to demonstrate how far we had to go and what we had to do in order to bring results in this remaining 50% has now concluded successfully. With modern techniques very, very closely followed, auditors trained by the central organization have been successfully clearing cases which were resistive and did not improve on all earlier processes as of 1951, 52, 53, and the bulk of 54. The certainty of clearing the first 50% simply with the magic words has been followed now with the certainty of handling the remaining 50%. This presents a rather different scene and attitude than 1950, where an auditor had to be intuitive and had to work endlessly, it seemed, to produce gains on cases, much less clearing. My own percentages in clearing people do not count, and I learned early, with some puzzlement, that what I did with the pre-clear and the results I obtained with the pre-clear were not the results which would be obtained by another auditor. It was this fact alone which caused research and investigation to be continued at such lengths and for processes to be codified so closely. For first we had to know the processes, and then we had to know how to train auditors, and finally we are obtaining these clearing results. Any clear earlier obtained was known to be clear simply by the fact that he could recall at will by pictures or could perform certain other feats. Actually, a person was only clear to stay clear when he was not immediately involved with either his analytical or his reactive mind. And those clears which remained stable had been put unwittingly into a much more advanced state than had been supposed even by the auditor. It was an investigation of these clears which led forward into the techniques we have now. It was found that many of them were simply wide-open cases which had become rather able to read their own facsimiles. Several had simply increased their abilities to a point so senior to other people's ability that everyone agreed they should be called clear. And then there was the actual clear. The actual clear, on close questioning, even though he himself had not always noticed it, conceived himself now to be some distance from the body. Those clears which remained stable and continued to perform and function despite the convulsions of life were these who had been stably exteriorized. This may be a datum which is very hard for some Dianeticists to assimilate, but again the difficulty would stem only from the fact that these would be unwilling to look at space or would be afraid of being disenfranchised. Such people are very frightened of losing their bodies. But this is a fact with which we cannot argue, that so far as psychosomatic ill is concerned, it is best resolved by exteriorization. One has the individual step back from his body, look at it, and patch it up. And that is about all there is to psychosomatic illness. There is, of course, an electronic structure of the body which one can direct a person's attention to. But I have seen the shape of a face change in moments. I have seen psychosomatic illnesses disappear in seconds, and, as long as there was any physical structure left to work with at all, I have seen the problem of psychosomatic illness pushed so far in the background as a problem that we no longer think in these terms, and indeed do not consider Dianetics well used when it is only addressed to psychosomatic illness and aberration. Our emphasis today is upon ability. We have found that the more we increase the ability of a person, the better the byproducts around him become. Simply by increasing an individual's ability to walk or talk, we can change his physical beingness and his mental outlook. By this theory, it would be enough to have somebody learn how to make pottery, or drive a car, or sing, or speak in public to increase his mental and physical health. And indeed, on investigation, we discover that these things are therapeutic. But we discover that they are limited in their therapy, because the talents which an individual learns in this fashion are talents involved entirely with the handling and orientation of the body, and he is not being entirely influenced merely by his body. He is being influenced as well by the computing machinery which he calls his analytical mind, and by the more insidious and less obvious machinery called his reactive mind. Furthermore, by these increases in ability, he is not brought up to a point of where he can control or handle his entire environment. Such an ability can be developed only by and in the awareness of awareness unit itself. When it is learning to do something via the body, it is not learning to do something directly. It is learning to do something with help, the help of arms and legs, face, voice, eyes, and thus hobby therapy is limited even though it is quite positive. Looking a little further along this line, one discovers that the awareness of awareness unit has peculiar abilities. First and foremost of its abilities is to be where it likes to be and look. It does not need eyes. It does not need a vehicle in which to travel. All it needs to do is to postulate its existence in a certain location and then look from that point of existence. In order to do this, it has to be willing to be cause. It has to be willing to be an effect. But if it can do this, it can go much further. It can create and change space. Furthermore, it can erase at a glance facsimiles and engrams. Now, when we get into such capabilities, People are liable to believe that we have entered the field of mysticism or spiritualism, but an inspection of these fields demonstrates the people in them not to be very able. Mysticism and other such practices are reverse practices. Rather than controlling the reactive bank, the analytical mind, the body, the environment, they seek very markedly to withdraw from the necessity to control. This is downward ability, and while I might be accused of maligning these fields, I can only look at the people I have known in these fields and at the fact that I, myself, studied in these fields in the East and know their limitations. People are apt to confuse exteriorization with astral walking. As you sit there reading this book, you are definitely and positively aware of sitting there and of this book. There is no question about whether or not you are looking at a book. You don't believe yourself to be projected, and you don't have to guess where you are. And you don't think you have to create some sort of image in order to look at anything. You are simply sitting there reading a book. This is exteriorization. If you were cleared and, with your body at home, you were in a library, you could read in the library just as well, with the limitation that you might not have a good grasp on pages. You would certainly know you were in the library. There would be no question about this. There would be no question about the text on the periodicals on the table, be no question about the quality and personality of the librarian and other people sitting there. Being clear does not enter into it guesswork. You would not be concerned with telepathy, with reading people's minds, and with other such bric-a-brac. You would simply know what you wanted to know. Further, you wouldn't have to use a system for finding out what you know. You would simply know it. If man cannot face what he is, then man cannot be free. For an awareness of awareness unit surrounded entirely by energy masses and believing that it itself is completely these masses is in a difficult and desperate state. It believes, for instance, that in order to go from one address to another, it has to take the energy mass along with it. This is not true. One might carry a body around in order to speed up one's conversation, in order to have a problem, in order to get some attention and interest from people. But one would not carry a body around because one had to have a body. The general attitude of a person who is cleared is the most interesting thing to observe. Only a cleared person has a very definite tolerance for the behavior of others. People, before they are cleared, are in a varying degree of distrust of other people. They are hiding or protecting or owning things to such a degree that they do not dare separate themselves from them. There is a certain fear of an exteriorized person. There is a belief that he might do them wrong. Actually, one is done wrong by the weaklings of this world, not the strong men. One does not have to enslave and control by force those whose conduct he does not fear. When you find an individual who is bent entirely upon a course of the arduous control of the motions of others, you are looking at an individual who is afraid. By their fear you shall know them. Another slight difficulty in the state of exteriorization is that one has a tendency to let things be more or less as they are. Up to a certain point, one is content to let the game run and take part in it and have fun with it. The point, of course, is the destruction of the playing field. Life, to a clear, is no more and no less than a game. And the only thing which he would consider somewhat unpardonable in behavior would be the wiping out of such a playing field. But if he were even higher in such a state, he could theoretically make his own playing field. However, if he did this, he would find difficulty getting into communication with other live beings, unless, of course, he made them, which is a rather unsatisfactory state of affairs since one never quite forgets that he did so. Moral conduct is conduct by a code of arbitrary laws. Ethical conduct is conduct out of one's own sense of justice and honesty. When you enforce a moral code upon people, you depart considerably from anything like ethics. People obey a moral code because they are afraid. People are ethical only when they are strong. One could say that the criminals of earth are those upon whom moral codes have been too forcefully enforced. As an example of this, take the cliché object, the minister's son. Ethical conduct does not mean promiscuous, abandoned, or lawless conduct. It means conduct undertaken and followed because one has a sense of ethics, a sense of justice, and a sense of tolerance. This is self-determined morality. A clear has this to a very marked degree. By actual check of many such cases, Their moral behavior is intensely superior to that of people who pride themselves on being good. The point arises because law and order depends for its existence upon its necessity in the field of morals. And it looks with a sort of horror on somebody who would be good without recourse to or threat from the forces of law and order. Such a person would be rather hard to have around. He would cut down the number on the police force quite markedly. The state of clear, then, is obtainable and is desirable, and now that we can accomplish it with greater positiveness than in 1950, is found to be superior to that described in the second chapter of Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health. The way one goes about being clear or creating a clear is simple, but it requires a certain code of conduct called the Auditor's Code, and requires, we have discovered, a considerable amount of training. Clearing another person is a highly specialized ability. This ability must be raised in individuals before they can easily and successfully undertake such a project. Witnessing this is the fact that while many of the processes involved in clearing have been available for a very, very long time, very few people have successfully used them. The discovery of why this was quite as important as the state of clear itself. The remedy of this disability lies in training and processing. The activity of creating a clear is known as processing and is undertaken by one individual on behalf of another individual. Self-clearing has not been found possible where the individual was badly mired in his own case. Enormously subordinate to the goal of clear, but enormously senior to man's various healing activities in the mind, spirit, and body, the very processes which lead up to clear remedy, whether one wants them to or not, a great many of the ills of the individual. One can take one of these modern processes and run it all by itself and accomplish more with Dianetics than man had previously accomplished in the field of healing. When one has the answers, of course, applying those answers to minor psychosomatic difficulties or aberrations or spiritual unrest is elementary. But again, we have discovered that there is no real substitute for training, either at the hands of an already trained and skilled auditor or, best, from the central organization. The awareness of awareness unit was not readily discoverable in the field of physics because physics is entirely concerned with mechanics. Physics starts with the assumption of the conservation of energy, the existence of space, and goes on into further complexity from there. The awareness of awareness unit is one step earlier than all this, and its existence was unsuspected by a misdefinition in the field of physics. That was the definition of a static. A static in physics is called something which is in an equilibrium of forces. This object at rest in an equilibrium of forces is an interesting semantic puzzle. If we put a glass upon the table and then say that it is a static, we are telling a very bad lie. It is not in an equilibrium of forces. That glass happens to be traveling at 1,000 miles an hour just by reason of the fact that Earth is turning. It has 7 other directions and speeds by reason of being part of the planet Earth, the solar system, and this galaxy. It cannot, then, be considered at rest. Thus, no object can be considered at rest unless one considers something relatively at rest. The glass is at rest in relationship to the table, but this is not the physical definition. The definition of a static disclosed something else of interest. There was a missing definition in the field of mathematics, and that was the definition of zero. The mathematician for ages has been using in all of his formulas a wild variable without suspecting it was there. He did not really encounter it until he got into the higher fields of nuclear physics. At this time he encountered it so forcefully and knew it so little that he had to alter most of his mathematical conceptions in order to work with nuclear physics at all. This wild variable was no less than zero. Zero, put down as a goose egg in a mathematical formula, would introduce many interesting variables. In the first place, an absolute zero has never been obtained in this universe. It has only been approached, that is, in terms of temperature, that is, in terms of non-existence. We can say there is a zero of apples, but that is still a qualified zero. We can say there were no apples, but that is further qualified as being in the past and is a past zero. We can say there will be no apples, and again we will have a zero qualified as being in the future. Zero was an absence of a thing, and this immediately violated the definition of a zero as being no thing. The absoluteness of no thing had to be examined while we were examining the field of the mind, and actually led to some very astonishing discoveries with regard to life itself, and immediately pinpointed the existence of the awareness of awareness unit. The proper and correct definition of zero would be something which had no mass, which had no wavelength, which had no location in space, which had no position or relationship in time. This would be a zero. One could state it more shortly, if a little less correctly, as something without mass, meaning, or mobility. It would be almost impossible to detach a dyed-in-the-wool physicist from the concept that everything was a somethingness and that there was actually a nothingness. However, there is a nothingness which has quality, it has potential, it has ability. It has the ability to perceive, the ability to create, the ability to understand, and the ability to appear and disappear to its own satisfaction in various positions in space. Furthermore, this thing could, we have demonstrated conclusively, manufacture or cause to vanish space, energy, and masses, and could, quite additionally, reposition time. These new concepts are actually advances in the field of physics and mathematics, and, from the viewpoint of the physicist and the mathematician, would only incidentally apply to the mind. From this data, we get the basic definition of a static, which is an actuality of no mass, no wavelength, no position in space or relation in time, but with the quality of creating or destroying mass or energy, of locating itself or creating space, and in re-relating time. And thus we have the definition of an awareness of awareness unit. It is the definition of a static. It does not have quantity, it has quality. It does not have mechanics, it can produce mechanics. And it does have ability. The foremost ability of the awareness of awareness unit is to have an idea and to continue that idea and to perceive the idea and its continuance in the form of mass, energy, objects, and time. In the field of Scientology, the fact that this awareness of awareness unit can also control or even make physical bodies is almost incidental. That is only a specialized branch of the game. In Dianetics, this is a very important function, for one in Dianetics is working with man. A static could also be called an orientation point. It would be from that point that it made and directed space, energy, and objects. It would be from that point that it assigned meanings. And thus we have an essential difference between the awareness of awareness unit and its byproducts. These byproducts we can categorize as symbols. When we say mechanics, we actually mean, to some degree, symbols. A symbol is something that has mass, meaning, and mobility, 3 M's. That is the technical definition of a symbol. An orientation point is something that controls symbols. The difference in ability of an awareness of awareness unit is how much it is an orientation point in relationship to how much it believes itself to be a symbol or to have mass, meaning, and mobility. Reduction from the state of awareness is into the condition of the symbol, mass, meaning, and mobility. To get a clearer idea of this, you see the word A on this page. That has mass, even if very slight mass. It has meaning since it converts an idea when glanced at, and it certainly has mobility since you can move the book around. Now you, looking at the book, have the role of an orientation point to the degree that you do not conceive yourself to have a fixed identity, a fixed position, a fixed mass. If you, looking at this book, have no real mass, if your name is not a tremendously fixed idea with you, and if you know you can move your body around without having to move with it, then you would very clearly and decisively be an orientation point. But if you think you have mass and are mass, and if you think you are your name, and if you think you have to move around only by moving the body around, then of course somebody else, something else can be your orientation point. It may be your mother, it may be your hometown, or if you are a mystic, it might even be some spirit. You would think of yourself as a symbol. Similarly, a symbol does not remember anything more than it symbolizes, and thus your memory to a large degree might be the memory of past allies, people who took care of you and to whom you were attached affectionately. And if you were in a lecture, you would probably take notes rather than remember what was being said. An orientation point has the power of memory without record. A symbol has the power of memory only to the degree that it is a record. Thus we see that it is desirable that an individual does not identify himself with masses, but that he retain his ability to handle masses and objects and energy, to remember at will without the need of records, such as those in the reactive bank, or facsimile machines, such as those in the analytical mind bank. In any good, thorough investigation, one investigates to see what he will discover and to find better ways to do things. In any reliable investigation report, one tells what he discovered and reports its character and nature. In this science, we are doing just that. When we talk of the awareness of awareness unit, we are not talking to be pleasing, to win friends, or influence professors. We are simply telling you what has been discovered after 25 years of research and investigation in the field of the mind, having taken off from the platform of physics and mathematics rather than philosophy. The awareness of awareness unit is a fact. It is a demonstrable fact, and the best way to demonstrate it is to use the processes which accomplish it and then discover that the individual is more well, has a better memory, is better oriented, is more capable, is more ethical, is happier, has a better command of time, can communicate better, is more willing to have friends, is less antisocial than the average person, and has a greater zest for living and getting things done. All these things can be accomplished by test. In 1950, we often had occasion to demonstrate the existence of the engram. It seemed to be highly in question amongst those people who were extremely specialized, it said on their diplomas, in the field of the mind. To be accomplished in the field of the mind and yet not know anything about engrams or facsimiles would be an idiotic state indeed, because the mind is composed of facsimiles and engrams, if one wishes to examine items or energy products. Well, then as now, we are only interested in results. What can we do with this technology? If we can demonstrate with this technology that we can better the lives, tolerances, abilities of those around us, then certainly we will have done something. We have no place for philosophical arguments concerning this material. It is simply workable material. You do not argue with the directions on how to open a vacuum-packed can. If you don't follow them, you don't get the can open. Or not following them and still being insistent upon it, you smash the can and ruin the contents. One would not go into a philosophic dissertation about the directions of opening a can. Obviously, they are written by somebody who knows how to open cans, and any hours spent on getting this person to demonstrate that he really could open cans would be wasted time. The thing to do is simply to read the directions, follow them very closely, and see whether or not the can is opened. Although this seems to be a rather common sort of an example to apply to that noble creature, man, it is nevertheless the bluntest statement that could be made about the status of Dianetics and Scientology and their uses and purposes. Dianetics has as its goal the repairing and patching up of this thing called, by the uninitiated, a civilization, taking its destiny out of the hands of madmen who think that the entire organism is simply a machine and putting it in the hands of the same people, only this time with the ingredient of sanity added. There isn't even any point in trying to categorize Dianetics or say that it compares to psychology or mathematics or engineering or any other activity, because it is obviously senior to all these activities and doesn't have to take any of these activities into account to work. All Dianetics needs to work is a trained auditor, pre-clear, and a little time in which to accomplish its processes. If these ingredients, the auditor, the pre-clear, and a little time, were not available, then there would be no purpose in having any Dianetics at all, since there wouldn't be any human race. The spirit in which these conclusions are advanced is intensely practical. And now that some nitwits, who probably don't get along with their wives and hate dogs, but who have worked themselves into the position of being able to, can knock a couple of atoms together, either by orders or by actual skill, and so tear up a very nice playing field, the presence of Dianetics in this world is not simply a practicality, but an urgency. Chapter 4. Accent on Ability. Almost anyone realizes that he can be better than he is, that he can do things better than he has been doing them. It is an entirely different thing to ask someone to realize that he is ill, aberrated, or stupid. Why is it that a man can understand that he can be more capable and very often cannot understand that he is incapable? It would seem to follow that if a man realized he could be more capable, then he would realize at once that he was to some degree less capable than he could be. For various reasons, however, this does not follow. One is confronted many times too often by his insistence upon brilliance of a very stupid man. It could be said with some truth that the person who asserts he needs to know no more to be fully as bright as his fellows would upon examination be discovered to be quite deficient in capability and understanding. Earth has had many examples of this. The fascist is probably best described as a very stupid man who insists upon a status quo which is intolerable for all others, yet who believes himself to be brighter than all others. But even the fascist of the most modern sort, the fission fascist, would be the first to admit that both he and others could do a better job of being fascistic. The basic reason for this is a simple one, almost idiotically simple. One can understand understanding and can see that understanding can increase. Stupidity, ignorance, illness, aberration, incapability are only a fall away from understanding and are themselves less understanding, and so are less understandable. One does not understand that he might get worse, and so does not have any great communication with people who tell him that he will get worse. The dying man believes right up to the moment of the last breath, no matter what he is saying to his doctor or family, that he is going to get better. He has no understanding of that state of non-understandingness called death. One can understand the understandable. One cannot understand the incomprehensible, because the definition of incomprehensibility is non-understandability. As I said, this is an almost idiotically simple situation. Life in its highest state is understanding. Life in its lower states is at a lower level of understanding. And where life has ceased to function and has arrived at what one might call total incapability, there is no understanding at all. In Dianetics and Scientology, we have a great deal to do with this subject called understanding. Understanding has very specific component parts. These component parts are affinity, reality, and communication. Affinity, reality, and communication form an interdependent triangle. It is easily discovered on some inspection that one cannot communicate in the absence of reality and affinity. Further, one cannot have a reality with something with which he cannot communicate and for which he feels no affinity. And similarly, one has no affinity for something on which he has no reality and on which he cannot communicate. Even more narrowly, one does not have affinity for those things on which he has no reality and which he cannot communicate upon. One has no reality on things which he has no affinity for and cannot communicate upon. And one cannot communicate upon things which have no reality to him and for which he has no affinity. A graphic example of this would be anger. One becomes angry, and what one says does not then communicate to the person at whom one might be angry. Even more crudely, the fastest way to go out of communication with the machine would be to cease to feel any affinity for it and to refuse to have any reality upon it. We call this triangle the ARC triangle. The precision definitions of these three items are as follows. 1. Communication is the interchange of ideas or particles between 2 points. More precisely, the formula of communication is cause, distance, effect, with intention and attention, and a duplication at effect of what emanates from cause. The component parts of communication are consideration, intention, attention, cause, source point, distance, effect, receipt point, duplication, the velocity of the impulse or particle, nothingness or somethingness. A non-communication consists of barriers. Barriers consist of space, interpositions, such as walls and screens of fast-moving particles, and time. 2. Reality is the degree of agreement reached by two ends of a communication line. In essence, it is the degree of duplication achieved between cause and effect. That which is real simply because it is agreed upon and for no other reason. 3. Affinity is the relative distance and similarity of the two ends of a communication line. Affinity has in it a mass connotation. The word itself implies that the greatest affinity there could be would be the occupation of the same space. And this, by experiment, has become demonstrated. When things do not occupy the same space, their affinity is delineated by the relative distance and the degree of duplication. See the fold-out chart in the audiobook directory, which provides these definitions for continued reference with subsequent text. These three items, affinity, reality, and communication, can be demonstrated to equate into understanding. Above understanding is knowingness, without formula or design. And this might be considered to be a unit activity. Dropping down from a complete knowingness, we would arrive into the realm of understanding, for this is a third dynamic manifestation peculiar to two or more individuals. Were you to be a clever mathematician, you could discover by symbolic logic how all mathematical formulas could be derived from this principle, that understanding is composed of affinity, reality, and communication. No mathematics falling outside this triangle is a valid mathematics to man. There is no additional factor in understanding except significance. But this, of course, is the idea or consideration mentioned in number 1 above, communication. It is a truism that if we could understand all life, we would then tolerate all life. Further, and more germane to ability, if one could occupy the position of any part of life, one would feel a sufficient affinity for life to be able to merge with it or separate from it at will. When we say life, all of us know more or less what we are talking about. But when we use this word life practically, we must examine its purposes and behavior, and in particular, the formulas evolved by life in order to have a game called life. When we say life, we mean understanding. And when we say understanding, we mean affinity, reality, and communication. To understand all would be to live at the highest level of potential action and ability. The quality of life exists in the presence of understanding, in the presence then of affinity, reality, and communication. Life would exist to a far less active degree in the levels of misunderstanding, incomprehensibility, psychosomatic illness, and physical and mental incapabilities. Because life is understanding, it attempts to understand. When it turns and faces the incomprehensible, it feels balked and baffled, feels there is a secret, and feels that the secret is a threat to existence. A secret is antipathetic to life, and therefore life, in searching for those things which would seem to reduce it, will hit upon various secrets it must discover. The basic secret is that a secret is an absence of life, and a total secret would be a total unlivingness. Now let us look at this formula of communication and discover that we must have a duplication and effect of what emanates from cause. The classic example here is a telegram sent from New York City to San Francisco which says, "I love you." When it arrives in San Francisco, the machinery of communication has perverted it so that it says, "I loathe you." This failure of duplication is looked upon as an error and would cause considerable problems and trouble. It could not then be considered to be a very good communication. Nothing wrong with the basic intention. There was nothing wrong with the attention which would be given the wire in San Francisco. The only thing that was wrong was a failure to duplicate at effect of what emanated at cause. Now, if life is understanding, it would find it very, very difficult to communicate with something which was non-understanding. In other words, life, faced with a non-understanding thing, would feel itself balked. For life, being understanding, could not then become non-understanding without assuming the role of being incomprehensible. Thus it is that the seeker after secrets, unless his way is carefully wended, is trapped into being a secret himself. Where one has an effect point, which is an incomprehensible thing, and where one is occupying the cause point, in order to get any communication through to the effect point at all, it would be necessary for the one at cause point to somehow or another reduce his understandingness down toward incomprehensibility. The salesman knows this trick very well. He looks at his customer, recognizes his customer is interested in golf, and then pretends to be interested in golf himself in order to have the customer receive his sales talk. The salesman establishes points of agreement and potential duplication, and then proceeds into a communication. Thus, searchers after truth have often walked only into labyrinths of untruth, secrets, and have themselves become incomprehensible with conclusions of incomprehensibility. Thus we have the state of beingness of the philosophic textbooks of earth. A wonderful example of this is Immanuel Kant, the great Chinaman of Königsberg, whose German participial phrases and adverbial clauses, and whose entire reversal of opinion between his first and second book, balks all our understanding as it has the understanding of philosophic students since the late 18th century. But the very fact that it is incomprehensible has made it endure, for life feels challenged by this thing which, pretending to be understanding, is yet an incomprehensibility. This is the grave into which so many philosophers walk. This is the coffin into which the mathematician, seeking by mathematics the secrets of the universe, eventually nails himself. But there is no reason why anyone should suffer simply because he looks at a few secrets. The test here is whether or not an individual possesses the power to be at his own determinism. If one can determine himself to be incomprehensible at will, he can of course then determine himself to be comprehensible again. But if he is obsessively and without understanding being determined into incomprehensibilities, then of course he is lost. Thus we discover that the only trap into which life can fall is to do things without knowing it is doing them. Thus we get to a further delineation of the secret, and we discover that the secret, or any secret, could exist only when life determined to face it without knowing and without understanding that it had so determined this action. The very best grade secret, then, would be something which made life also tend to forget that it was looking at a secret. One can always understand that his ability can increase because in the direction of an increase of ability is further understanding. Ability is dependent entirely upon a greater and better understanding of that field or area in which one cares to be more able. When one attempts to understand less ability, he is of course looking at less comprehensibility, less understanding, and so does not then understand lessening ability anywhere near as well as he understands increasing ability. In the absence of understanding of ability, we get a fear of loss of ability, which is simply the fear of an unknown or a thought to be unknowable thing. For there is less knownness and less understanding in less ability. Because life does not want to face things which are less like life, it has a tendency to resist and restrain itself from confronting the less comprehensible. It is this resistance alone which brings about the dwindling spiral, the descent into less ability. Life does not will this descent into less ability unless life is cognizant of the principles involved. Life resists itself into this less ability. There is a primary rule working here. That which one fears, one becomes. When one refuses to duplicate something and yet remains in its environment, his very resistance to the thing he refuses to duplicate will cause him eventually to become possessed of so many energy pictures of that thing which he refuses to duplicate that he will, to have any mass at all, find himself in possession of those energy pictures, and, without actually noticing what has happened, is very likely to accept at their level those things which he refused to duplicate earlier. Thus we get the riddle of the engram, the facsimile, if we understand at the same time that life does not necessarily find it bad to have masses of energy around, and is, indeed, unhappy unless it does have some energy. For if there is no energy, then there is no game. Life has a motto that any game is better than no game. It has another motto, any havingness is better than no havingness. Thus we find individuals clutching to them the most complex and destructive of facsimiles and mechanisms. They do not necessarily want these complexities, and yet they want the energy or the game which these complexities would seem to offer them. If you would make anyone well, you must then concentrate upon an increase of ability, an increase of understanding. The only reason bad things come to life is because understanding has impressed further life into them. When an individual faces some secret, the fact that he is facing it and injecting life into it alone causes the secret to activate and have force and action. The only way a bad situation in existence can continue to have life is by taking life from nearby sources of communication. The bad things of life, then, have life only to that degree that understanding is invested in them. We have an example in poliomyelitis, which was at one time an extremely minor and unheard of illness. By various publications, by a great deal of advertising, by many invitations to combat this illness, it is made to take prominence and manifest itself in the society. The only life, actually, which poliomyelitis has is the amount of life which can be invested in poliomyelitis. Yet poliomyelitis, one thinks, would exist and continue its way if it were ignored. If one were to go on ignoring poliomyelitis, now that one knows about poliomyelitis, yes, this would be the case. The disease would continue to exist, although everyone was studiously ignoring it. As a matter of fact, it would get worse. If, however, it were to be completely understood, and if an ability on the part of individuals existed by which they could face it without having to resist it, then the matter would be solved. One wonders why all the nurses and doctors in contagious wards do not immediately pick up the illness. And here we have another factor, which is the same factor as understanding, but couched in a different way. People do not acquire obsessively those things which they do not fear. An individual has to resist something, has to be afraid of something, has to be afraid of the consequences of something before it can have any adverse obsessive effect upon him. At any time he could have a self-determined duplication of it. But this, not being obsessive, not being against his will, would of course not produce any ill symptom beyond the length of time he determined it. Part of understanding and ability is control. Of course, it is not necessary to control everything, everywhere, if one totally understands them. However, in a lesser understanding of things, and of course in the spirit of having a game, control becomes a necessary factor. The anatomy of control is start, stop, and change. This is fully as important to know as understanding itself and as the triangle which composes understanding: affinity, reality, and communication. The doctors and nurses in a contagious ward have some feeling of control over the illnesses which they see before them. It is only when they begin to recognize their inability to handle these ills or these patients that they themselves succumb to this. In view of the fact that of recent centuries we have been very successful in handling contagious diseases, doctors and nurses then can walk with impunity through contagious wards. The fighters of disease, having some measure of control over the disease, are then no longer afraid of the disease, and so it cannot affect them. Of course, there would be a level of body understanding on this which might yet still mirror fear, but we would have the same statement obtaining. People who are able to control something do not need to be afraid of it and do not suffer ill effects from it. People who cannot control things can receive bad effects from those things. Here we have an example of what might happen in the realm of disease. How about human aberration? We discover that the sanitariums of the world are all too often inhabited, in addition to patients, by those persons who were formerly at work in these institutions. It is a rather shocking thing to discover, in Ward 9, the nurse who was once supervisor of a mental hospital. Now here we had a condition where there was no control or understanding. People did not understand mental illness, aberration, insanity, neurosis. The first actual effort along this line which cut down the tally was Freudian analysis. And yet this, requiring much too long, was not an effective weapon. These doctors and nurses in institutions, who then are themselves patients in the same institution, knew definitely that they did not have any real control over insanity. Thus, having no control over it, they became subject to it. They could not start, stop, and change insanity. The franticness of this state is represented by the medieval torture which has been utilized in such institutions as cures. By cure, the people in charge of such institutions merely meant quieter. The natural course of existence would lead them to think in terms of euthanasia, and so they have, that it would be best to kill the patient rather than to have his insanity continue. And they have even accomplished this at the rate of 2,000 mental patients a year dead under electric shock machines. And they have accomplished it by a very high percentage dead under brain operations. The only effectiveness of electric shock and brain operations would be to render the patient less alive and more dead. And the end product achieved so many times of death would, of course, be the only way to stop the insanity. These people, of course, could not envision the fact that immortality and insanity in a future generation would crop up as a problem. They had to conceive that if they killed the patient, or simply made him much quieter, they had then triumphed to some degree. The fact that man, sane or insane, is not to be destroyed according to law weighs against this solution. With Dianetics, to use the study in a relatively narrow field of application, we have assumed some control over insanity, neurosis, aberration, and can actually start, stop, and change aberration. In the first book, Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, techniques were present which would place in view and then vanquish almost any mental manifestation known in the field of insanity and aberration. Where an auditor was unable to do anything for the insane or the neurotic, the fault, if fault there was, generally lay in the fact that the auditor was actually afraid. His fear was born entirely out of his insecurity in starting, stopping, and changing the condition. In modern instruction at Hubbard Professional College, there is little or no emphasis placed upon the case of the student, and yet when the student graduates, he is discovered to be in a very high tone. The entire concentration is upon giving the student the ability to handle any and all types of case, and he becomes sufficiently secure in his ability, if he is graduated, to walk without any fear and with considerable calm through areas of psychosis, neurosis, and physical illness. He has been given the technologies by which these misbehaviors of life can be controlled. In view of the fact that he can start, stop, and change them, he need no longer fear them and could with impunity work around the insane, if this were his mission. The handling of psychosis, neurosis, and psychosomatic illness does not happen to be the mission of the auditor. Indeed, these things get well only if they are more or less ignored. As long as the accent is upon ability, any malfunction will eventually vanish. The mission of the auditor is in the direction of ability. If he increases the general ability of the pre-clear in any and all fields, then of course any misabilities, such as those represented by psychosis, neurosis, and psychosomatic illness, will vanish. The auditor, however, is not even covertly interested in these manifestations. Around him, he sees a world which could be far more able. It is his business to make it so. While business in general does not recognize there is anything wrong with its abilities, it can recognize that its abilities can be better. One well-trained auditor working with group processing on the United States Air Force could treble the number of pilots successfully graduated from the schools and could reduce the crash toll of high-speed planes by fully 3/4. This is not a wild statement. It is simply an application of the research data already to hand. The mission is greater ability, not an eradication of inability. Just to give more understanding to those around him could be said to be a sufficient mission for a well-trained auditor, for by doing so, he would certainly increase their ability. By increasing their ability, he would be able to increase their life. The common denominator of all neurosis, psychosis, aberration, and psychosomatic ill is can't work. Any nation which has a high incidence of these is reduced in production, is reduced in longevity. Amongst the unable is the criminal, who is unable to think of the other fellow, unable to determine his own actions, is unable to follow orders, unable to make things grow, is unable to determine the difference between good and evil, is unable to think at all on the future. Anybody has some of these. The criminal has all of them. LRH. And what does one do about how bad it is? If one depends upon others or the environment to do something about it, he will fail. From his viewpoint, the only one who can put more life, more understanding, more tolerance, and more capability into the environment is himself. Just by existing in a state of higher understanding, without even being active in the field of auditing, just by being more capable, an individual could resolve for those around him many of their problems and difficulties. The accent is on ability. Chapter 5. The Auditor's Code. There are several codes in Scientology and Dianetics. The only one which has to be obeyed, if we wish to obtain results upon a pre-clear, is the Auditor's Code 1954. In the first book, Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health, we had an Auditor's Code which was derived more or less from an ideal, rather than from practical experience. In the ensuing years, a great deal of auditing has been done, and a great many errors have been made by auditors. And when we have taken the common denominator of what has caused pre-clears to make small or negative progress, we discover that these can be codified so as to inform the auditor who wishes to get results what to avoid in his processing. When a psychoanalyst or psychologist uses Dianetics, he is very prone to be operating in his own frame of conduct. It is the conduct of the practitioner, almost as much as the processes which makes Dianetics work. In psychoanalysis, for instance, we discovered that the basic failure of Freud's work in practice, and as used by analysts, fails chiefly because of two things done by the analyst in the consultation room. Whatever the value of Freud's libido theory, the effectiveness is reduced by the analyst's evaluation for the patient. The patient is not allowed to work out his own problems or come to his own conclusions. He is given ready-made interpretations. In psychology, there is no operating code, for clinical psychology is not much practiced and is indeed outlawed in many states. While psychiatry might have a modus operandi, none of those conversant with this handling of the insane, the function of psychiatry, would call it a code intended to induce a better state of beingness in a patient. In education, which is in itself a therapy, we discover an almost total absence of codified conduct beyond that laid down by school boards to regulate the social attitude of and restrain the possible cruelty in educators. Although education is very widespread, and indeed is the practice best accepted by the society for the betterment of individuals, it yet lacks any tightly agreed upon method or conduct codification for the relaying of data to the student. Custom has dictated a certain politeness on the part of the professor or teacher. It is generally believed to be necessary to examine with rigor and thoroughness. Students are not supposed to whisper or chew gum, but education in general has no code designed to oil the flow of data from the rostrum to the student bench. On the contrary, a great many students would declare that any existing code was designed to stop any flow whatever. Dianetics is in an interesting position in that it is itself. And although people may try to classify it with mental therapy, it is closer to the level of education so far as the society itself is concerned. Its goal is the improvement of the mind on a self-determined basis, and its intended use is upon individuals and groups. Because it is an accumulation of data which is apparently the agreed-upon factors from which existence is constructed, and although the simple perusal of this data very often frees an individual, it is also disseminated on an individual and group basis, directly to individuals and groups, and is a form of self-recognition. If you were to make the best progress along any highway, you would do well to follow its signs. In the Auditor's Code of 1954, we have a number of signposts, and if their directions are pursued, a maximum of result will result. If they are not pursued, one is liable to find the pre-clear over in the ditch, in need of a tow truck in the form of a better auditor. Quite in addition to the command of the processes themselves, the difference between the book auditor and the professional auditor lies in the observance of this code. A very great deal of time is invested in the auditor at Hubbard Professional College in demonstrating to him the effects of disobedience of this code and obedience of it, and in leading him to practice it closely. This supervision at the Hubbard Professional College is relatively simple. One takes a look at the class and finds somebody who is not in good shape. One discovers who audited him, and one then knows what auditor is not following the auditor's code. The offending student is then taken aside and briefed once more. A graduating auditor has to know this code by heart, and more importantly, has to be able to practice it with the same unconscious ease as a pilot flies a plane. The auditor's code follows, and is included in the audiobook directory. The Auditor's Code, 1954. 1. Do not evaluate for the pre-clear. 2. Do not invalidate or correct the pre-clear's data. 3. Use the processes which improve the pre-clear's case. 4. Keep all appointments once made. 5. Do not process a pre-clear after 10 p.m. 6. Do not process a pre-clear who is improperly fed. 7. Do not permit a frequent change of auditors. 8. Do not sympathize with the pre-clear. 9. Never permit the pre-clear to end the session on his own independent decision. 10. Never walk off from a pre-clear during a session. 11. Never get angry with a pre-clear. 12. Always reduce every communication lag encountered by continued use of the same question or process. 13. Always continue a process as long as it produces change and no longer. 14. Be willing to grant beingness to the pre-clear. 15. Never mix the processes of Dianetics with those of various other practices. 16. Maintain two-way communication with the pre-clear. If one were to sort out these various provisos, he would discover all of them important, but that 3 of them were more vitally concerned with processing than the others, and that these 3, if overlooked, would inevitably and always result in case failure. These 3 are the difference between a good auditor and a bad auditor. They are numbers 12, 13, and 16. In 12, we discover that the auditor should always reduce every communication lag encountered by continued use of the same question or process. Almost every case failure contains some of this. The difference between a professional auditor and a book auditor is most visible in this and the other 2 provisos mentioned. A good auditor would understand what a communication lag is, the length of time intervening between the asking of the question and the receiving of a direct answer to that question, regardless of what takes place in the interval. And he would be very careful to use only those processes on the pre-clear which the pre-clear could reasonably answer up to. And he would be very certain not to walk off from a communication lag into which the session had entered. A bad auditor would believe, when he had struck a communication lag, that he had simply found a blind alley and would hastily change to some other question. In number 13, always continue a process as long as it produces change and no longer, we find the greatest frailty on the part of auditors. An auditor who is not in good condition or who is not well trained will Q&A with the pre-clear. When the pre-clear starts to change, the auditor will change the process. By Q&A, we mean that the answer to the question is the question, and we indicate a duplication. Here we find an auditor possibly so much under the command of the pre-clear rather than the reverse that the auditor simply duplicates obsessively what the pre-clear is doing. The pre-clear starts to change, therefore the auditor changes. A process should be run as long as it produces change. If the pre-clear is changing, that is what the auditor wants. If the auditor were to stop and change off to some other process just because the pre-clear had attained some change, we would discover some very sick pre-clears. Additionally, an auditor is liable to continue a process long after it has stopped producing change. He and the pre-clear get into a sort of a marathon, a machine-motivated grind, on the process opening procedure by duplication, which probably after 10 hours produced no further alteration in the pre-clear. Yet this pair might go on to 50 hours with the process and would be quite disheartened to discover that for 40 hours nothing had happened. This, however, is much less harmful as an action than the changing of the process simply because it is producing change. The maintenance of a two-way communication is the most touchy activity in auditing. An auditor being the auditor and being concentrated upon controlling the pre-clear, all too often forgets to listen when the pre-clear speaks. Many an auditor is so intent upon the process that when it produces a change which the pre-clear thinks he should advise upon, the auditor ignores him. Ignoring the pre-clear at a time when he wishes to impart some vital information generally sends the pre-clear directly into apathy. At the same time, an auditor should not permit a pre-clear to keep on talking forever, as in the case of a lady recently reported who talked to the auditor for 3 days and 3 nights. The therapeutic value of this was 0, for the auditor was listening to a machine, not to the pre-clear. One should understand rather thoroughly the difference between an obsessive or compulsive communication line and an actual communication. Listening to circuits, of course, validates circuits. The auditor should pay attention to the rational, the usual, the agreed upon, and should leave very much alone the bizarre, the freakish, the compulsive, and the obsessive manifestations of the pre-clear. The maintenance of a two-way communication is actually a process in itself, and is the first, most basic process of Dianetics and continues on through all remaining processes. Simply because we have pinpointed 3 of these is no reason to ignore the others. Every time there has been a psychotic break, by reason of or during auditing, it has occurred when the processing was being done late at night, when the pre-clear was improperly fed, when the pre-clear had had a frequent change of auditors, and when two-way communication had not been maintained, and the effort on the part of the pre-clear to impart a vital change to the auditor was ignored. All these psychotic breaks were repaired, but because these factors were present, the patching up was rather difficult. Audit them early, audit them bright, listen to what they have to say about what's happening, make sure they are eating regularly, and change auditors on a pre-clear as seldom as possible, and no psychotic breaks will occur. If you are simply investigating Dianetics to discover whether or not it is workable, You should be aware of the fact that the Auditor's Code, following of, is an essential portion of Dianetics. Dianetics functions very poorly in the absence of the Auditor's Code. It is part of the process, not simply a polite way to go about handling people. Thus, if Dianetics is tested in the absence of the Auditor's Code, do not pretend that it has been tested at all. Another phrase might have been added to this code, but it would be more germane to living than to auditing, and that phrase would be, maintain silence around unconscious or semi-conscious people. The reason for this is contained in Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, in the chapter Preventive Dianetics. Such statements become engrammic. The addition of this to the Auditor's Code, however, is not practical, for the auditor often finds himself talking to a groggy pre-clear. Because the auditor is reducing every communication lag he encounters by the repetition of the question, the asking of a question or giving of a command to a semi-conscious pre-clear is thus rendered relatively unaberrative. For sooner or later, the question embedded in the unconsciousness will work loose, and indeed, the communication lag will not flatten until this occurs. Thus, simply the reduction of the communication lag in itself eradicates such phrases. Thus, this is not part of the Auditor's Code. However, when we encounter unconsciousness or semi-consciousness, as in moments immediately after the injury of a child, a street accident, an operation, we maintain silence, for we are not auditing the person. Mothers and fathers would spare themselves a great deal of later mental unrest on the child's part if they knew and would follow this injunction. And in many other ways, it is a very important one. A man can be killed by too much conversation around him while he is injured. No matter how deeply unconscious he may appear to be, something is always registering. The questioning by police at the scene of an accident, where the person being questioned is in a state of shock or where other accident victims are present, is probably the most aberrative conduct in this society. The questioning by police is quite restimulative in any event, and many severe complications after accidents have been traced immediately to this activity on the part of the police. It might be very important for some ledgers somewhere to know exactly who caused this. It is more important that the people involved in it live and be happy afterward. It is not that we do not like police. This is not the case. We simply believe that the police should be civilized too. Simply memorizing this code is not enough. Memorizing it in order to practice it is indicated, but it is the practice of this code which is important. Observance of it is the hallmark of a good auditor, and it signalizes the recovery of the case. If an auditor is going to raise the ability of the pre-clear, his ability in the field of auditing must be considerable. That ability begins with the understanding and observance of the Auditor's Code, 1954. Chapter 6. Trapped. In Greece, Rome, England, colonial America, France, and Washington, a great deal of conversation is made on the subject of freedom. Freedom apparently is something that is very desirable. Indeed, freedom is seen to be the goal of a nation or a people. Similarly, if we are restoring ability to the pre-clear, we must restore freedom. If we do not restore freedom, we cannot restore ability. The muscle-bound wrestler, the tense driver, the rocket jockey with a frozen reaction time alike are not able. Their ability lies in an increase of freedom, a release of tension, and a better communication to their environment. The main trouble with freedom is it does not have an anatomy. Something that is free is free. It is not free with wires, vias, bypasses, or dams. It is simply free. There is something else about freedom which is intensely interesting. It cannot be erased. In Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, we learned that pleasure moments were not erasable. The only thing that was erasable was pain, discomfort, distortion, tenseness, agony, unconsciousness. In more modern Scientological parlance, freedom cannot be as is. It is something which is imperishable. You may be able to concentrate somebody's attention on something that is not free and thus bring him into a state of belief that freedom does not exist, but this does not mean that you have erased the individual's freedom. You have not. All the freedom he ever had is still there. Furthermore, freedom has no quantity, and by definition it has no location in space or time. Thus we see the awareness of awareness unit as potentially the freest thing there could be. Thus man's concentration upon freedom. But if freedom has no anatomy, then please explain how one is going to attain to something which cannot be fully explained. If anyone talks about a road to freedom, he is talking about a linear line. This then must have boundaries. If there are boundaries, there is no freedom. This brings the interesting proposition to mind that the very best process, by theory, would be to have an individual assume himself to be free, and then he would simply be asked to assume himself to be free again. Indeed, on many cases of a high-toned variety, this is a quite workable process. An individual is sick. He is usually in very good tone. The auditor simply asks him to assume that he is free, and he will cease to be sick. This magic, however, is limited to those people who have some concept of what free means. Talk to a person who works from 8 o'clock until 5, with no goals, with no future, and no belief in the organization or its goals, who is being required by time payments, rent, and other barriers of an economic variety to invest all of his salary as soon as it is paid, and we have an individual who has lost the notion of freedom. His concentration is so thoroughly fixed upon barriers that freedom has to be in terms of less barriers. Thus, in processing, we have to audit in the direction of less and less barriers in order to attain freedom. If freedom is so very compelling and is so useful and is in itself something like a synonym for ability, even if not entirely, then it is our task to understand a little more about freedom as itself in order to accomplish its attainment. For unfortunately, it is not enough to the bulk of the human race simply to say, be free and have the individual recover. Life is prone to a stupidity in many cases in which it is not cognizant of a disaster until the disaster has occurred. The Middle Western farmer had a phrase for it, lock the door after the horse is stolen. It takes a disaster in order to educate people into the existence of such a disaster. This is education by pain, by impact, by punishment. Therefore, a population which is faced with a one-shot disaster that will obliterate the sphere would not have a chance to learn very much about the sphere before it was obliterated. Thus, if they insisted upon learning by experience in order to prevent such a disaster, they would never have the opportunity. If no atomic bomb of any kind had been dropped in World War II, it is probable there would be no slightest concern about atomic fission, although atomic fission might have developed right on up to the planet buster without ever being used against man, and then as a planet buster being used on Earth, so destroying it. If a person did not know what a tiger was, and we desired to demonstrate to him that no tigers were present, we would have a difficult time of it. Here we have a freedom from tigers without knowing anything about tigers. Before he could understand an absence of tigers, he would have to understand a presence of tigers. This is the process of learning we know as by experience. In order to know anything, if we are going to use educational methods, it is necessary then to know as well its opposite. The opposite of tigers probably exists in Malayan jungles, where tigers are so frequent that the absence of tigers would be a novelty indeed. A country which was totally burdened by tigers might not understand at all the idea that there were no tigers in some parts of the world, and a great deal of argument would have to be entered into with the populace of a tiger-burdened area to get them to get any inkling of what an absence of tigers would be. Many cases in processing have suddenly lost a somatic to discover themselves in a new and novel state. This somatic was so routine and so constant and so pervasive that they could not intellectually conceive of what life would be like without that particular somatic. The understanding of freedom, then, is slightly complex in that individuals who do not have it are not likely to understand it. And thus we find an individual who knows nothing about exteriorization and knows everything about being in constant contact with the sensations of a body, failing to grasp the idea of the freedom resulting from exteriorization. These people do not even believe that exteriorization can exist, and so combat it. They are so little experienced on the subject of freedom that this type of freedom is known to be non-existent to them. The way to demonstrate the existence of freedom is to invite the individual to experience freedom. But if he does not know what freedom is, then he will not exteriorize. We have to hit some sort of a gradient scale on the matter, or make him turn around and look squarely at the opposite of freedom. But the opposite of freedom is slavery. Everybody knows this. Or is it? I do not think these two things are a dichotomy. freedom is not the plus of the condition where slavery is the minus, unless we are dealing entirely with the political organism. Where we are dealing with the individual, better terminology is necessary and more understanding of the anatomy of minus freedom is required. Minus freedom is entrapment. Freedom is the absence of barriers. Less freedom is the presence of barriers. Entirely minus freedom would be the omnipresence of barriers. A barrier is matter or energy or time or space. The more matter, energy, time, and space assume command over the individual, the less freedom that individual has. This is best understood as entrapment, since slavery connotates an intention, and entrapment might be considered almost without intention. A person who falls into a bear pit might not have intended to fall into it at all, and the bear pit might not have intended a person to fall upon its stake. Nevertheless, an entrapment has occurred. The person is in the bear pit. If one wants to understand existence and his unhappiness with it, he must understand entrapment and its mechanisms. In what can a person become entrapped? Basically and foremost, he can become entrapped in ideas. In view of the fact that freedom and ability can be seen to be somewhat synonymous, then ideas of disability are first and foremost in entrapment. I dare say, amongst men, the incident has occurred that a person has been sitting upon a bare plain in the total belief that he is entirely entrapped by a fence. There is that incident mentioned in Self-Analysis of fishing in Lake Tanganyika, where the sun's rays, being equatorial, pierce burningly to the lake's bottom. The natives there fish by tying a number of slats of wood on a long piece of line. They take either end of this line and put it in canoes, and then paddle the two canoes toward the shallows of the lake, the slatted line stretching between. The sun, shining downward, presses the shadows of these bars down to the bottom of the lake, and thus a cage of shadows moves inward toward the shallows. The fish, seeing this cage contract upon them, which is composed of nothing but the absence of light, flounder frantically into the shallows where they cannot swim, and are thus caught, picked up in baskets, and cooked. Yet there was nothing to be afraid of but shadows. When we move out of mechanics, man finds himself on unsure ground. The idea that ideas can be so strong and pervasive is foreign to most men. For instance, a government attacked by the communist does not perceive that it is being attacked only by ideas. It believes itself to be attacked by guns, bombs, armies, and yet it sees no guns, bombs, armies. It sees only men standing together, exchanging ideas. Whether these ideas are sound or not is beside the point. They are at least penetrative. No 16-inch armor plate could possibly stop an idea. Thus a country can be entrapped, taken and turned toward communism simply by the spread of the communistic idea. A country that fails to understand this arms itself, keeps its guns cocked, its armies alert, and then succumbs at last to the idea, now entered into the head of the armed forces which it so hopefully employed. The collapse of Germany in World War I was an instance of this. Its armies, its grand fleet were all flying the red flag. Although Allied pressure and the conditions of starvation in Germany had much to do with this defeat, nevertheless it was keyed into being by this communist idea infiltrated into the minds of the men who originally were armed and trained to protect Germany. And communism, just as an idea, traps the minds of men. They find themselves organized into cells. They find their customs abandoned, and a regimented, militant, biological, soulless tyranny their master. Here is an idea becoming a sort of trap. So, first and foremost, we have the idea. Then, themselves the product of ideas, we have the more obvious mechanics of entrapment in matter, energy, space, and time. The most common barrier, which man recognizes as such, would be a wall. This is so obviously a barrier that individuals quite commonly suppose all barriers to be composed of solid walls. However, almost any object can be made into a barrier. A less common use of an object as a barrier would be one which inhibited, by some sort of suction or drag, a departure from it. A solid lump of considerable magnetic properties will hold to it a piece of steel. Gravity is, then, a barrier of a kind. It holds the people or life units of Earth to Earth. Another barrier would be energy. A sheet of energy or something carrying energy, such as an electrical fence, can prove to be a formidable barrier. A cloud of radioactive particles obstructing passage into another space would also be a barrier. Tractor-type beams, as in the case of gravity but in the form of energy, could be seen to be a barrier of sorts. Yet another barrier, easily understood, is that of space. Too much space will always make a barrier. Space debars an individual from progressing into another part of the galaxy. One of the finest prisons one could imagine would be one located on a small piece of matter surrounded by such a quantity of space that no one could cross it. Space is such an efficient barrier that people in the southwest of the United States committing crimes discover their way everywhere blocked by the giganticness of space. In New York City, it would be very easy for them, after the commission of a crime, to vanish. But in attempting to cross a space of such size as the Southwest, they become exposed everywhere to view, there being nothing else on which the police can fix their attention. Quite another barrier, less well understood but extremely thorough, is the barrier of time. Time debars your passage into the year 1776 and prevents your repossession of things which you had in your youth. It also prevents you from having things in the future. Time is an exceedingly effective barrier. The absence of time can also be a barrier, for here an individual is unable to execute his desires and is so constricted by the pressure of time itself. Matter, energy, space, and time can all, then, be barriers. An awareness of awareness unit, however, which is the personality and beingness of the person and which is composed of quality, not quantity, can be anywhere it wishes to be. There is no wall thick enough, nor any space wide enough, to debar the reappearance at some other point of an awareness of awareness unit. In that this is the individual, and not some ghost of the individual, and as the individual is himself an awareness of awareness unit, and not his machinery and his body, we see that as soon as one understands completely that he is an awareness of awareness unit, he no longer is restricted by barriers. Thus, those who would seek entrapment for individuals are entirely antipathetic toward the idea of exteriorization. And a person who knows nothing but barriers is apt to believe that a condition of no barriers could not exist. Yet a condition of no barriers can exist, and this is itself freedom. Examining freedom, then, we have to examine why people do not attain it easily or understand it. They do not attain freedom because their attention is fixed upon barriers. They look at the wall, not the space on either side of the wall. They have entities and demon circuits which demand their attention. And indeed, the body itself could be considered to be an attention-demanding organism. One might believe that its total function was to command interest and attention. It is so interesting that people do not conceive that just behind them lies all the freedom anybody ever desired. They even go so far as to believe that that freedom is not desirable, and that if they could attain it, they would not want it. One is reminded of prisoners who occasionally go so sufficiently stir-crazy as to demand, after their release from prison, confining walls and restricted spaces. Manuel Komroff once wrote a very appealing story on this subject, the story of an old man who had served 25 years in prison, or some such time, and who on his release asked for nothing more than the smallest room in his son's house, and was happiest when he could see someone on an opposite roof who had the appearance of a guard, and who actively put bars back on his window. One could consider a person who has been for a long time in a body to have such a fixation upon the barriers imposed by the body that once an auditor tries to remove them, the preclear puts them back quickly. You might say such a person is stir-crazy, yet the condition is remediable. The anatomy of entrapment is an interesting one, and the reason why people get entrapped, and indeed the total mechanics of entrapment, are now understood in Scientology. A great deal of experimentation was undertaken to determine the factors which resulted in entrapment, and it was discovered that the answer to the entire problem was two-way communication. Roughly, the laws back of this are: fixation occurs only in the presence of one-way communication. Entrapment occurs only when one has not given or received answers to the thing entrapping him. Thus we see the ARC triangle itself, and most importantly, the communication factor of that triangle, looming up to give us a roadway to freedom. It could be said that all the entrapment there is the waiting one does for an answer. Here we find man. Basically, he is an awareness of awareness unit which is capable of and active in the production of matter, energy, space, and time, as well as ideas. We discover that he is more and more fixated upon ideas, matter, energy, space, and time, and the processes and functions involving these. And we discover that these, being the product of the awareness of awareness unit, do not supply answers to the awareness of awareness unit unless the awareness of awareness unit supplies itself those answers. Entrapment is the opposite of freedom. A person who is not free is trapped. He may be trapped by an idea. He may be trapped by matter. He may be trapped by energy. He may be trapped by space. He may be trapped by time. And he may be trapped by all of them. The more thoroughly the pre-clear is trapped, the less free he is. He cannot change, he cannot move, he cannot communicate, he cannot feel affinity and reality. Death itself could be said to be man's ultimate in entrapment. For when a man is totally entrapped, he is dead. It is our task in investigation and auditing to discover for the individual and the group the roadway to a greater freedom, which is the roadway to a greater ability. The processes the auditor uses today are designed entirely to secure greater freedom for the individual, for the group, for mankind. Any process which leads to a greater freedom for all dynamics is a good process. It should be remembered, however, that an individual functions on all dynamics, and that the suppression by the individual of the third or fourth dynamic leads to less freedom for the individual himself. Thus, the criminal, becoming immorally free, harms the group and harms mankind, and thus becomes less free himself. Thus there is no freedom in the absence of affinity, agreement, and communication. Where an individual falls away from these, his freedom is sharply curtailed, and he finds himself confronted with barriers of magnitude. The component parts of freedom, as we first gaze upon it, are then affinity, reality, and communication, which summate into understanding. Once understanding is attained, freedom is obtained. For the individual who is thoroughly snarled in the mechanics of entrapment, it is necessary to restore to him sufficient communication to permit his ascendance into a higher state of understanding. Once this has been accomplished, his entrapment is ended. None of this is actually a very difficult problem, and the auditing done today is very simple. But where the auditing is done by a person who does not basically desire the freedom of the individual, a further entrapment is more likely to ensue than further freedom. The obsessively entrapped are then enemies of the pre-clear, for they will trap others. A greater freedom can be attained by the individual. The individual does desire a greater freedom once he has some inkling of it, and auditing, according to the precision rules and codes of Dianetics and Scientology, steers the individual out of the first areas of entrapment to a point where he can gain higher levels of freedom, either by further auditing or by himself. The only reason we need a regimen with which to begin is to start an individual out of a mirror maze of such complexity that he himself, in attempting to wend his way, only gets lost. This is Dianetics 55. Chapter 7. Communication. Communication is so thoroughly important today in Dianetics and Scientology, as it always has been on the whole track, that it could be said if you were to get a pre-clear into communication, you would get him well. This factor is not new in psychotherapy, but concentration upon it is new, and interpretation of ability as communication is entirely new. If you were to be in thorough and complete communication with a car and a road, you would certainly have no difficulty driving that car. But if you were only in partial communication with the car and in no communication with the road, it is fairly certain that an accident will occur. Most accidents do occur when the driver is distracted by an argument he has had, or by an arrest or a white cross alongside the road that says where some motorist got killed, or by his own fears of accidents. When we say somebody should be in present time, we mean he should be in communication with his environment. We mean further that he should be in communication with his environment as it exists, not as it existed. And when we speak of prediction, we mean that he should be in communication with his environment as it will exist, as well as it exists. If communication is so important, what is communication? It is best expressed as its formula, which has been isolated, and by use of which a great many interesting results can be brought about in ability changes. There are two kinds of communication, both depending upon the viewpoint assumed. There is outflowing communication and inflowing communication. A person who is talking to somebody else is communicating to that person we trust, and the person who is being talked to is receiving communication from that person. Now, as the conversation changes, we find the person who has been talked to is now doing the talking and is talking to the first person who is now receiving communication from. A conversation is the process of alternating outflowing and inflowing communication. And right here exists the oddity which makes aberration and entrapment. There is a basic rule here. He who would outflow must inflow. He who would inflow must outflow. When we find this rule overbalanced in either direction, we discover difficulty. A person who is only outflowing communication is actually not communicating at all, in the fullest sense of the word. For in order to communicate entirely, he would have to inflow as well as outflow. A person who is inflowing communication entirely is, again, out of order. For if he would inflow, he must then outflow. Any and all objections anyone has to social and human relationships are to be found basically in this rule of communication, where it is disobeyed. Anyone who is talking, if he is not in a compulsive or obsessive state of beingness, is dismayed when he does not get answers. Similarly, anyone who is being talked to is dismayed when he is not given an opportunity to give his replies. Even hypnotism can be understood by this rule of communication. Hypnotism is a continuing inflow without an opportunity on the part of the subject to outflow. This is carried on to such a degree in hypnotism that the individual is actually trapped in the spot where he is being hypnotized and will remain trapped in that spot to some degree from there on. Thus, one might go so far as to say that a bullet's arrival is a heavy sort of hypnotism. The individual receiving a bullet does not outflow a bullet, and thus he is injured. If he could outflow a bullet immediately after receiving a bullet, we could introduce the interesting question, would he be wounded? According to our rule, he would not be. Indeed, if he were in perfect communication with his environment, he could not even receive a bullet injuriously. But let us look at this from a highly practical viewpoint. As we look at two life units in communication, we can label one of them A and the other one of them B. In a good state of communication, A would outflow and B would receive. Then B would outflow and A would receive. Then A would outflow and B would receive. Then B would outflow and A would receive. In each case, both A and B would know that the communication was being received and would know what and where was the source of the communication. All right, we have A and B facing each other in a communication. A outflows. His message goes across a distance to B, who inflows. In this phase of the communication, A is cause, B is effect, and the intervening space we term the distance. It is noteworthy that A and B are both life units. A true communication is between two life units. It is not between two objects or from one object to one life unit. A life unit, is cause. The intervening space is distance. B, a life unit, is effect. Now a completion of this communication changes the roles. Replied to, A is now the effect and B is the cause. Thus we have a cycle which completes a true communication. The cycle is cause, distance, effect, with effect then becoming cause and communicating across a distance to the original cause, which is now effect. And this we call a two-way communication. See the fold-out chart in the audiobook directory for the formula of communication, the component parts of communication, and the two-way cycle of communication for continued reference in studying this text. As we examine this further, we find out that there are other factors involved. There is A's intention. This at B becomes attention. And for a true communication to take place, a duplication at B must take place of what emanated from A. A, of course, to emanate a communication, must have given attention originally to B, and B must have given to this communication some intention, at least to listen or receive. So we have both cause and effect having intention and attention. Now there is another factor which is very important. This is the factor of duplication. We could express this as reality, or we could express it as agreement. The degree of agreement reached between A and B in this communication cycle becomes their reality. And this is accomplished mechanically by duplication. In other words, The degree of reality reached in this communication cycle depends upon the amount of duplication. B, as effect, must to some degree duplicate what emanated from A as cause in order for the first part of the cycle to take effect. And then A, now as effect, must duplicate what emanated from B for the communication to be concluded. If this is done, there is no aberrative consequence. If this duplication does not take place at B and then at A, we get what amounts to an unfinished cycle of action. If, for instance, B did not vaguely duplicate what emanated from A, the first part of the cycle of communication was not achieved, and a great deal of randomity, explanation, argument might result. Then, if A did not duplicate what emanated from B when B was cause on the second cycle, again, an uncompleted cycle of communication occurred with consequent unreality. Now, naturally, if we cut down reality, we will cut down affinity. So where duplication is absent, affinity is seen to drop. A complete cycle of communication will result in high affinity and will, in effect, erase itself. If we disarrange any of these factors, we get an incomplete cycle of communication, and we have either A or B or both waiting for the end of cycle. In such a wise, the communication becomes aberrative. The word aberrate means to make something diverge from a straight line. The word comes basically from optics. Aberration is simply something which does not contain straight lines. A confusion is a bundle of crooked lines. A mass is no more and no less than a confusion of mismanaged communications. The energy masses and deposits, the facsimiles and engrams, surrounding the preclear are no more and no less than unfinished cycles of communication, which yet wait for their proper answers at A and B. An unfinished cycle of communication generates what might be called answer hunger. An individual who is waiting for a signal that his communication has been received is prone to accept any inflow. When an individual has, for a very long period of time, consistently waited for answers which did not arrive, any sort of answer from anywhere will be pulled into him by him as an effort to remedy his scarcity for answers. Thus, he will throw engramic phrases in the bank into action and operation against himself. Uncompleted cycles of communication bring about a scarcity of answers. It does not much matter what the answers were or would be, as long as they vaguely approximate the subject at hand. It does matter when some entirely unlooked-for answer is given, as in compulsive or obsessive communication, or when no answer is given at all. Communication itself is aberrative only when the emanating communication at cause was sudden and non sequitur to the environment. Here we have violations of attention and intention. The factor of interest also enters here, but is far less important, at least from the standpoint of the auditor. Nevertheless, it explains a great deal about human behavior and explains considerable about circuits. A is interested and has the intention of interesting B. B, to be talked to, becomes interesting. Similarly, B, when he emanates a communication, is interested and A is interesting. Here we have, as part of the communication formula, but as I said, a less important part, the continuous shift from being interested to being interesting on the part of either of the terminals, A or B. Cause is interested, effect is interesting. Of some greater importance is the fact that the intention to be received on the part of A places upon A the necessity of being duplicatable. If A cannot be duplicatable in any degree, then of course his communication will not be received at B. For B, unable to duplicate A, cannot receive the communication. As an example of this, A, let us say, speaks in Chinese where B can only understand French. It is necessary for A to make himself duplicatable by speaking French to B, who only understands French. In a case where A speaks one language and B another, and they have no language in common, we have the factor of mimicry possible, and a communication can yet take place. A, supposing he had a hand, could raise his hand. B, supposing he had one, could raise his hand. Then B could raise his other hand, and A could raise his other hand. And we would have completed a cycle of communication by mimicry. Communication by mimicry could also be called communication in terms of mass. We see that reality is the degree of duplication between cause and effect. Affinity is monitored by intention and the particle sizes involved as well as the distance. The greatest affinity there is for anything is to occupy its same space. As the distance widens, affinity drops. Further, as the amount of mass or energy particles increases, so again does affinity drop. Further, as the velocity departs from what A and B have considered optimum velocity, either greater or lesser velocity than what they consider to be the proper velocity, affinity drops. There is another fine point about communication, and that is expectancy. Basically, all things are considerations. We consider that things are, and so they are. The idea is always senior to the mechanics of energy, space, time, mass. It would be possible to have entirely different ideas about communication than these. However, these happen to be the ideas of communication which are in common in this universe and which are utilized by the life units of this universe. Here we have the basic agreement upon the subject of communication in the communication formula, as given above. Because ideas are senior to this, an awareness of awareness unit can get, in addition to the communication formula, a peculiar idea concerning just exactly how communication should be conducted, and if this is not generally agreed upon, can find himself definitely out of communication. Let us take the example of a modernistic writer who insists that the first 3 letters of every word should be dropped, or that no sentence should be finished, or that the description of characters should be held to a cubist rendition. He will not attain agreement amongst his readers, and so will become, to some degree, an only one. There is a continuous action of natural selection, one might say, which weeds out strange or peculiar communication ideas. People, to be in communication, adhere to the basic rules as given here, and when anyone tries to depart too widely from these rules, they simply do not duplicate him, and so, in effect, he goes out of communication. We have seen an entire race of philosophers go out of existence since 1790. We have seen philosophy become a very unimportant subject, where once it was a very common coin amongst the people. The philosophers themselves put themselves out of communication with the people by insisting on using words of special definition which could not be assimilated with readiness by persons in general. The currency of philosophy could not be duplicated by those with relatively limited vocabularies. Take such jaw-cracking words as telekinesis. While it probably means something very interesting and very vital, if you will think back carefully, no taxi driver has mentioned the word to you while you were paying your fare, or even during the more verbose moments of the ride. Probably the basic trouble with philosophy was that it became Germanic in its grammar, an example set by Immanuel Kant. And if you will recall that wonderful story by Saki, a man was once trampled to death while trying to teach an elephant German irregular verbs. Philosophy shed some of its responsibility for a cycle of communication by rendering itself unduplicatable by its readers. It is the responsibility of anyone who would communicate that he speak with such vocabulary as can be understood. Thus, philosophy did not even begin for some 150 years a sound cycle of communication, and thus is dead. Now let us take up the individual who has become very experienced in life. This individual has a time track in particular. His time track is his own time track. It isn't anyone else's time track. The basic individualities amongst men are based upon the fact that they have different things happen to them and that they view these different things from different points of view. Thus we have individualization, and we have individual opinion, consideration, and experience. 2 men walking down the street witness an accident. Each one of them sees the accident from at least a slightly different point of view. Consulting 12 different witnesses of the same accident, you are likely to find 12 different accidents. Completely aside from the fact that witnesses like to tell you what they think they saw, instead of what they saw, there were actually 12 different points from which the accident was viewed, and so 12 different aspects of the occurrences. If these 12 were brought together, and if they were to communicate amongst themselves about this accident, they would then reach a point of agreement on what actually happened. This might not have been the accident, but it certainly is the agreed-upon accident, which then becomes the real accident. This is the way juries conduct themselves. They might or might not be passing upon the real crime, but they are certainly passing upon an agreed-upon crime. In any war, it takes 2 or 3 days for enough agreement to occur to know what took place in a battle. Whereas there might have been a real battle, a real sequence of incidents and occurrences, the fact that every man in the battle saw the battle from his own particular point of view, by which we mean severely, point from which he was looking, rather than his opinions, no one saw the battle in its entirety. Thus, time must intervene for enough communication on the subject of the battle to take place so that all have some semblance of agreement on what occurred. Of course, when the historians get to this battle and start writing different accounts of it out of the memoirs of generals who were trying to explain away their defeats, we get a highly distorted account indeed. And yet, this becomes the agreed-upon battle as far as history is concerned. Reading the historians, one realizes one will never really know what took place at Waterloo, at Bennington, at Marathon, in that we can consider as a communication one soldier shooting at another soldier. We see that we are studying communications about communications. This scholarly activity is all very nice, but does not carry us very far toward the resolution of human problems. We have seen these two words, cause and effect, playing a prominent role in the communication formula. We have seen that first cause became, at the end of the cycle, last effect. Furthermore, the intermediate point, first effect, immediately changed to cause in order to have a good communication cycle. What then do we mean by cause? Cause is simply the source point of emanation of the communication. What is effect? Effect is the receipt point of the communication. In that we are only interested in life units, we see that we can readily ascertain cause at any time. We are not interested in secondary or tertiary cause. We are not interested in assisting causes in any way. We are not interested in secondary and tertiary effects. We are not interested in assisting effects in any way. We consider any time that we look at a source point of a communication that we are looking at cause. In that the entire track is composed of this pattern of cause and effect, an individual is very prone, whenever he sees a possible cause point, to look for an earlier cause point, and then an earlier one, and an earlier one, and an earlier one, and after a while takes to reading the Bible, which is very hard on the eyesight. In view of the fact that all cause is simply elected cause, and all effect is simply elected effect, and that the primary echelon is the idea level of communication, that is cause which we elect to be cause, that is effect which elects to be effect, and there is no more that can be said about it. Cause in our dictionary here means only source point. Effect means only receipt point. We notice that the receipt point, midway in the cycle of communication, shifts and becomes source point. We could classify this shift in this center of the cycle of communication in some other fashion, but it is not necessary to do so. We would be getting too particular for our purposes. Now we come to the problem of what a life unit must be willing to experience in order to communicate. In the first place, the primary source point must be willing to be duplicatable. It must be able to give at least some attention to the receipt point. The primary receipt point must be willing to duplicate, must be willing to receive, and must be willing to change into a source point in order to send the communication or an answer to it back. And the primary source point, in its turn, must be willing to be a receipt point. As we are dealing basically with ideas and not mechanics, we see then that a state of mind must exist between a cause and effect point, whereby each one is willing to be cause or effect at will, is willing to duplicate at will, is willing to be duplicatable at will, is willing to change at will, is willing to experience the distance between, and in short, willing to communicate. Where we get these conditions in an individual or a group, we have sane people. Where an unwillingness to send or receive communications occurs, where people obsessively or compulsively send communications without direction and without trying to be duplicatable, where individuals in receipt of communications stand silent and do not acknowledge or reply, we have aberrative factors. And it is very interesting to note, from the standpoint of processing, that we have all the aberrative factors there are. We do not need to know anything further about aberration than that it is a disarrangement of the cycle of communication. But to know that, of course, we have to know the component parts of communication and the expected behavior. Some of the conditions which can occur in an aberrated line are a failure to be duplicatable before one emanates a communication, an intention contrary to being received, an unwillingness to receive or duplicate a communication, an unwillingness to experience distance, an unwillingness to change, an unwillingness to give attention, an unwillingness to express intention, an unwillingness to acknowledge, and in general, an unwillingness to duplicate. We might go so far as to say that the reason communication takes place, instead of occupying the same space and knowing, for communication introduces the idea of distance, is that one is unwilling to be to the degree necessary to be anything. One would rather communicate than be. Thus we find that the inability to communicate is a gradient scale that goes down along with the inability to be. We get individuals winding up as only willing to be themselves, whatever that is, and thus becoming the only one. To the degree that a person becomes the only one, he is unwilling to communicate on the remaining dynamics. An individual who has become only himself is in a sad and sorry plight of being off the second, third, and fourth dynamics at least. It might be seen by someone that the solution to communication is not to communicate. One might say that if he hadn't communicated in the first place, he wouldn't be in trouble now. Perhaps there is some truth in this, but there is more truth in the fact that processing in the direction of making communication unnecessary or reducing communication is not processing at all, but murder. A man is as dead as he can't communicate. He is as alive as he can communicate. With countless tests I have discovered, to a degree which could be called conclusive, that the only remedy for livingness is further communicatingness. One must add to his ability to communicate. Probably the only major error which exists in Eastern philosophy, and probably the one at which I balked when I was young, was this idea that one should withdraw from life. It seemed to me that every good friend I had amongst the priests and holy men was seeking to pull back and cut off his communications with existence. Whatever the textbooks of Eastern philosophy may say, this was the practice of the people who were best conversant with Eastern mental and spiritual know-how. Thus I saw individuals taking 14 or 18 years in order to get up to a high level of spiritualistic serenity. I saw a great many men studying and very few arriving. To my impatient and possibly practical Western viewpoint, this was intolerable. For a very great many years, I asked this question: to communicate or not to communicate? If one got himself in such thorough trouble by communication, then of course one should stop communicating. But this is not the case. If one gets himself into trouble by communicating, he should further communicate. More communication, not less, is the answer. And I consider this riddle solved after a quarter of a century of investigation and pondering. Chapter 8. The Application of Communication. If you think we are talking about anything very esoteric or highly mathematical, kindly read the communication formula again. See the fold-out chart in the audiobook directory for reference to the formula of communication and its component parts. Just because we are speaking of the basic fundamentals of sanity, aberration, freedom, ability, truth, knowledge, and secrets, is no reason why we have to be complicated. We expect the fundamentals of behavior to be complicated simply because so many highly complicated people have discussed the subject. If Immanuel Kant couldn't, and if Adler addled communication, there is no reason why we should. As we speak of the applications of communication, we are speaking of complexities of these fundamentals. And having isolated the fundamentals, we do not then see any complexity in the product of the basics. Let us say that we thoroughly understand that 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now we write this on a piece of paper and put it on a table. It is still understandable. Now we write on another piece of paper 2 plus 2 equals 4 and put it on the same table. Now on a third piece of paper we write 2 plus 2 equals 4 and add it to those on the table. We take 4 tablets full of paper and on each sheet we write 2 plus 2 equals 4 and tearing each sheet out, add these. Now we get some blocks of wood and we write 2 plus 2 equals 4 on these blocks of wood. We get some leather and charcoal and write 2 plus 2 equals 4 and add that to the table. Then we get some blackboards and on each one write 2 plus 2 equals 4 and put them on the table. And we get some colored chalk and write 2 plus 2 equals 4 in various colors on another blackboard and put it on the table. Then we have 2 plus 2 equals 4 bound in vellum and add that to the pile on the table. Then we get some building bricks and we scratch on them 2 plus 2 equals 4, and put them on the table. Now we get 4 gallons of ink and pour it over 2 plus 2 equals 4 and smear everything we have put on the table. Now we take a bulldozer and push the table out through the wall. We take a steamroller and run over the debris. We take some concrete and pour it over the hole and let it dry. And we still have not altered the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4. In other words, no matter what mechanics we add to the communication formula, no matter what form we use to communicate, no matter how many types of words and meanings we place into the communication formula to become messages, no matter how we scramble meanings, messages, cause points, and effect points, we still have the communication formula. Here we have an individual. He has been living for a many-evented lifetime. He began life, let us say, with a perfect grasp of the communication formula. His experience has been consistent departures from the communication formula, only to the degree that he failed to emanate or failed to receive, twisted, perverted, or failed to return communications. And at the end of that lifetime, all we would have to do to put him into excellent condition would be to restore, in its complete clarity, his ability to execute the communication formula. The only thing which has happened to him has been violation of the communication formula. He emanated something, it was not received. When it was received, it was not acknowledged. When it replied, he did not receive it. And thus, he begins to look further and further afield for communications and becomes more and more complicated in his view of communications, becomes less and less duplicatable, is less and less able to duplicate, his intentions swerve further and further, his attention becomes more and more altered. What should have been straight lines wind up in a ball, and we have our pre-clear, after a lifetime of living with Homo sapiens. All we would have to do to get him into the most desirable clarity would be to restore his ability to perform the various parts of the communication formula and his ability to apply that formula to anything in this or any universe. He would have to be willing to duplicate anything. He would have to be willing to make himself duplicatable. He would have to be able to tolerate distance and velocities and masses. He would have to be able to form his own intentions. He would have to be able to give and receive attention. He would have to take or leave at will the intentions of others. And more important, he would have to be at any point and make it a cause or effect point at will. If he were able to do this, he could not possibly be trapped, for here we are intimately walking into the deepest secret of the trap. What is a secret? It is the answer which was never given, and this is all a secret is. Thus, knowledge and use of the communication formula within the framework of Dianetics and Scientology resolves any and all secrets and even the belief in secrets. The only thing which could be said to aberrate communication would be restriction or fear of restriction. A person who is not communicating is one who has restricted communication. A person who is communicating compulsively is afraid of being restricted in his communication. A person who is talking on another subject than that to which cause was giving his attention has been so restricted on the subject of communication elsewhere, or has experienced such a scarcity of communication elsewhere, that he is still involved with communication elsewhere. This is what we mean by not in present time. When we look at problems, without which humanity cannot seem to live, we discover that a problem is no more and no less than a confusion of communication lines, missing cause or effect points, undeterminable distances, misread intentions, missing attentions, and failures in the ability to duplicate and be duplicatable. Move off the communication formula in any direction, and a problem will result. A problem, by definition, is something without an answer, not because the two words are similar, but because all humanity has confused them. We find that answer to a communication and answer to a problem can, for our purposes, be synonymous. When one has failed to get answers consistently to his communications, he begins to run into a scarcity for answers, and he will get problems in order to have solutions. But he will not solve any of the problems because he already has a scarcity of answers. An auditor walks in on a pre-clear who has a scarcity of answers, finds the pre-clear has a circuit of problems, tries to resolve some of the problems of the pre-clear, discovers that the pre-clear creates new problems faster than old ones can be resolved. The one thing the pre-clear knows is that there aren't any answers, not to his particular kind of problems. He knows this to such a degree that he is unable to conceive of answers, which means to him that he is unable to conceive of solutions. He is like the old man in Manuel Komroff's story who, after his release from prison, yet created a cell of his own. He cannot look at freedom. He does not believe freedom exists. He cannot envision a world without tigers. The remedy for this, of course, is to have him remedy his lack of answers by having him mock up answers. That confused look you see on a mathematician's face is the task he has set himself to procure symbolic answers to hypothetical abstracts, none of which, of course, are human answers. The longer he symbolizes, the more formulas he creates, the further he drifts from the human race. Answers are answers only when they come from living units. All else is a glut on the market. No mathematical formula ever gave anybody any answer to anything, unless it was to the problem of communication itself. But this, I invite your attention, was not involved with and was not derived from mathematics as we know them. The communication formula was derived from an observation of and working with life. It could be derived only because one had entirely abandoned the idea that energy could tell anyone anything. Life is not energy. Energy is the byproduct of life. Your recluse is one who has become so thoroughly convinced that there are no obtainable answers from anyone that he does not any longer believe that life itself exists. He is the only living thing alive, in his opinion. Why? Because he is the only thing which communicates. I dare say every recluse, every only one, every obsessively or compulsively communicating individual has so thoroughly associated with life units which were so dead that it became very plain that no one else was alive. The attitude of the child toward the adult contains the opinion that adults have very little life in them. A child, with his enthusiasms, is in his family everywhere surrounded by communication blocks of greater or lesser magnitude. His questions do not get answered. The communications which are addressed to him are not posed in a way which can be duplicated. In other words, the adult does not make himself duplicatable. Freud and his confreres were entirely in error in believing that the child is totally self-centered. It is not the child who is totally self-centered. He believes that he is in communication with the total world. Investigation of children demonstrates that they are very heavy on the first, second, third, and fourth dynamics. The child is so convinced of his ability to communicate that he will touch a hot stove. Life has no terrors for him. He has not yet learned by experience that he cannot communicate. It's the adult who has drawn back into the only one. And one believes that the inspiration of this continuous belief on the part of the psychologist and psychoanalyst that the child is entirely self-centered and has only his own world must be the expression of an opinion held by the psychoanalyst and psychologist out of his own bank. As one grows, one goes less and less into communication with the environment until he is at last entirely out of it. Only he is out of it in the wrong direction. Dead. Where you see aberration, where you would wish to detect aberration, you must look for violations in the communication formula. People who consistently and continuously violate portions of the communication formula can be suspected of being just that, dead. The further one departs from the communication formula, the more death exists for them. The more concentrated they become on secrets, the more they question intentions, the less they are likely to assume the point of view called cause or the point of view called effect. One should not go so far as to say that life is communication. It is, however, a native condition of life to be able to communicate. Life, the awareness of awareness unit, the ability to have unlimited quality with no quantity or to produce quantity, is capable of communication. And here again, we are consulting ability. Ability, first and foremost, could be conceived to be the ability to be and also the ability to vary beingness. And this means the ability to communicate. One has to be able to be in order to communicate. One has to be able to vary one's beingness in order to return communications. There is the manifestation, then, known as the stuck flow. This is one-way communication. The flow can be stuck incoming or it can be stuck outgoing. The part of a communication cycle which goes from primary cause to effect may be the flow that is stuck, or it might be the other, from B back to A, that is stuck. Here we have several possible methods of achieving a stuck flow and several conditions of flow, 4 to be exact. 1. The flow can be stuck from primary cause to primary effect. from the viewpoint of primary cause. 2. The flow can be stuck from primary cause to primary effect from the viewpoint of primary effect. 3. The flow can be stuck from effect turned cause to final effect from the viewpoint of effect turned cause. 4. The flow can be stuck from effect turned cause to final effect from the viewpoint of final effect. These 4 stuck flows can become, any of them or a combination of them, the anatomy of the communication lag of the case. A person can hear but cannot answer. A person can cause a communication to begin but cannot receive an acknowledgement. A primary cause can be totally engrossed in keeping the flow from arriving at primary effect, and so forth. A failure to complete a cycle of communication will leave some part of that communication in suspense. It will leave it, in other words, silent. And this will stick on the track. It will float in time. It will restimulate. It will attract and hold attention long after it has occurred. Unconsciousness itself results from receipt of too much, too heavy communication. It can similarly, but less often, result from the emanation of too much, too heavy communication, as in the case of blowing up a large balloon where one becomes dizzy after the expulsion of too much breath. Theoretically, one sending a large mass toward another one might fall unconscious as a result of sending too much mass away from himself too suddenly, and we find this can be the case. This is degradation because of loss. One gives away too much or loses too much, and the departure of the mass or even the idea can bring about a drop in consciousness. In view of the fact that an awareness of awareness unit can create at will, this is not a very dangerous situation. One can receive too much communication too suddenly, such as a cannonball. Unconsciousness will result from this. Most engrams are composed of too much incoming mass and too much outgoing mass, so as to make a confusion into which any answer, any phrase interjected can then be effective, since there is a scarcity of phrases and a plus in masses. One could even go so far as to say that the only reason a mass interchange is ever effective in the line of unconsciousness is that it does not have enough reasons with it. I suppose if one explained carefully enough to a soldier why he had to be shot, the arrival of the bullet would not make him unconscious or hurt him. But again, this is theoretical, since very little reason goes on in war, and thus it has never been subjected to a clinical experiment. The resolution of any stuck flow is remedying the scarcity of that which stuck the flow. This might be answers, it might be original communications, it might be chances to reply. The communication formula at work is best understood through the communication lag. Chapter 9. Two-way communication. A cycle of communication and two-way communication are actually two different things. If we examine closely the anatomy of communication, we will discover that a cycle of communication is not a two-way communication in its entirety. If you will inspect Graph A below, you will see a cycle of communication. See the fold-out chart in the audiobook directory, which contains these graphic illustrations for reference throughout this chapter. Graph A. Joe to Bill, Bill Prime to Joe Prime. Here we have Joe as the originator of a communication. It is his primary impulse. This impulse is addressed to Bill. We find Bill receiving it, and then Bill originating an answer or acknowledgement as Bill Prime, which acknowledgement is sent back to Joe Prime. Joe has said, for instance, "How are you?" Bill has received this. And then Bill, becoming secondary cause, has replied to it as Bill Prime with, "I'm okay," which goes back to Joe Prime, and thus ends the cycle. Now, what we call a two-way cycle of communication may ensue, as in Graph B below. Graph B. Bill to Joe, Joe Prime to Bill Prime. Here we have Bill originating a communication. Bill says, "How's tricks?" Joe receives this. And then, as Joe Prime, or secondary cause, answers, "Okay, I guess," which answer is then acknowledged in its receipt by Bill Prime. In both of these graphs, we discover that the acknowledgement of the secondary cause was expressed, in Graph A, by Joe Prime, as a nod or a look of satisfaction, and again, in Graph B, Joe Prime's "okay, I guess" is actually acknowledged by Bill Prime with a nod or some expression signifying the receipt of the communication. If both Joe and Bill are strong silent men, highly aberrated, they would omit some portion of these cycles. The most flagrant omission, and the one most often understood as communication lag by the auditor, would be for Joe in graph A to say, "How are you?" and for Bill to stand there without speaking. Here we have Joe causing a communication and Bill Prime failing to continue the cycle. We do not know or inquire, and we are not interested in whether or not Bill, as the receipt point, ever did hear it. We can assume that he was at least present and that Joe spoke loudly enough to be heard and that Bill's attention was somewhere in Joe's vicinity. Now, instead of getting on with the cycle of communication, Joe is left there with an incompleted cycle and never gets an opportunity to become Joe Prime. There are several ways in which a cycle of communication could not be completed, and these could be categorized as 1. Joe failing to emanate a communication. 2. Bill failing to hear the communication. 3. Bill Prime failing to reply to the communication received by him. 4. Joe Prime failing to acknowledge, by some sign or word, that he has heard Bill Prime. We could assign various reasons to all this, but our purpose here is not to assign reasons why they do not complete a communication cycle. Our entire purpose is involved with the non-completion of this communication cycle. Now, as in graph A, let us say we have, in Joe, a person who is compulsively and continually originating communications, whether he has anybody's attention or not, and whether or not these communications are germane to any existing situation. We discover that Joe is apt to be met in his communicating with an inattentive Bill who does not hear him, and thus an absent Bill Prime who does not answer him, and thus an absent Joe Prime who never acknowledges. Let us examine this same situation in graph B. Here we have in Bill an origination of a communication. We have the same Joe with a compulsive outflow. Bill says, "How are you?" and the cycle is not completed because Joe, so intent upon his own compulsive line, does not become Joe Prime and never gives Bill a chance to become Bill Prime and acknowledge. Now let's take another situation. We find Joe originating communications and Bill a person who never originates communications. Joe is not necessarily compulsive or obsessive in originating communications, but Bill is aberratedly inhibited in originating communications. We find that Joe and Bill, working together, then get into this kind of an activity. Joe originates communication, Bill hears it, becomes Bill Prime, replies to it, and permits Joe a chance to become Joe Prime. This goes on quite well, but will sooner or later hit a jam on a two-way cycle which is violated because Bill never originates communication. A two-way cycle of communication would work as follows. Joe, having originated a communication and having completed it, may then wait for Bill to originate a communication to Joe, thus completing the remainder of the two-way cycle of communication. Bill does originate a communication. This is heard by Joe, answered by Joe Prime, and acknowledged by Bill Prime. Thus we get the normal cycle of a communication between two terminals. For in this case, Joe is a terminal and Bill is a terminal, and communication can be seen to flow between two terminals. The cycles depend on Joe originating communication, Bill hearing the communication, Bill becoming Bill Prime and answering the communication, Joe Prime acknowledging the communication. Then, Bill originating a communication, Joe hearing the communication, Joe Prime answering the communication, and Bill Prime acknowledging the communication. If they did this, regardless of what they were talking about, they would never become in an argument and would eventually reach an agreement, even if they were hostile to one another. Their difficulties and problems would be cleared up, and they would be, in relationship to each other, in good shape. A two-way communication cycle breaks down when either terminal fails in its turn to originate communications. We discover that the entire society has vast difficulties along this line. They are so used to canned entertainment and so inhibited in originating communications by parents who couldn't communicate and by education and other causes that people get very low on communication origin. Communication origin is necessary to start a communication in the first place. Thus, we find people talking mainly about things which are forced upon them by exterior causes. They see an accident, they discuss it. They see a movie, they discuss it. They wait for an exterior source to give them the occasion for a conversation. But in view of the fact that both are low on the origin of communication, which could also be stated as low on imagination, we discover that such people, dependent on exterior primal impulses, are more or less compulsive or inhibitive in communication and thus the conversation veers rapidly and markedly and may wind up with some remarkable animosities or misconclusions. Let us suppose that lack of prime cause impulse on Joe's part has brought him into obsessive or compulsive communication, and we find that he is so busy outflowing that he never has a chance to hear anyone who speaks to him, and, if he did hear them, would not answer them. Bill, on the other hand, might be so very, very, very low on primal cause, which is to say low on communication origination, that he never even moves into Bill Prime, or, if he does, would never put forth his own opinion, thus unbalancing Joe further and further into further and further compulsive communication. As you can see by these graphs, some novel situations could originate. There would be the matter of obsessive answering as well as inhibitive answering. An individual could spend all of his time answering, justifying, or explaining, all the same thing, no primal communication having been originated at him. Another individual, as Joe Prime in graph A or Bill Prime in graph B, might spend all of his time acknowledging, even though nothing came his way to acknowledge. The common and most noticed manifestations, however, are obsessive and compulsive origin and non-answering acceptance and non-acknowledgement of answer. And at these places we can discover stuck flows. As the only crime in the universe seems to be to communicate, and as the only saving grace of awareness unit is to communicate, we can readily understand that an entanglement of communication is certain to result. What we should understand, and much more happily, is that it can now be resolved. That which we are discussing here is minimally theory and maximally derived from observation. The main test of this is whether or not it resolves cases. You can be assured that it does. Flows become stuck on this twin cycle of communication where a scarcity occurs in 1. Origination of communication. 2. Receipt of communication. 3. Answering a communication given. 4. Acknowledging answers. Thus it can be seen that there are only 4 parts which can become aberrated, in both graph A and graph B, no matter the number of peculiar manifestations which can occur as a result thereof. These observations of communication are so vital that a considerable difference amongst case results comes about between an auditor who does acknowledge whatever his preclear answers and an auditor who does not. Let us take auditor G, and we discover that he is running opening procedure of 8C on a preclear, but that at the end of 2 hours of opening procedure of 8C, the preclear has benefited very little. Then let us take auditor K. This auditor does 15 minutes of opening procedure of 8C and gets very good results on the preclear. The difference between auditor G and auditor K is only that auditor G never acknowledges any answer or statement or communication origin on the part of the preclear. He simply continues doggedly with the process. Auditor K, on the other hand, is willing to let the preclear originate a communication and always acknowledges whenever the preclear concludes the action called for in a command, or when the preclear volunteers a verbal answer. In other words, G did not answer or acknowledge, but ran the process with mechanical perfection, and K both answered and acknowledged as well as originated orders. The fact that the scarcest thing there is the origin of orders or communications, and the fact that G was at least doing this is enough to cause G to get some improvement in the preclear, but he will not get anything like the improvement obtained by auditor K. Silence is nowhere desirable except only in permitting another to communicate or waiting for another to acknowledge. The auditing of silence will wind the preclear in a perfect fishnet of aberration. The total process which remedies this is remedying the scarcity, by whatever means, of the 4 parts of a two-way communication.